Welcome to ScareZone. Tonight we bring you hours of true horror stories to help you relax, sleep, or simply enjoy the atmosphere. If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe. Now, close your eyes and let the rain begin.
Of human consciousness by studying mine. They know now what we are, how we think, what we fear. I have become a door, a point of translation between their reality and ours. I must leave, but I fear I'm already too late. The correction is complete. I understand now. God help me, I understand. The notebook ended there. Hugh sat in the growing darkness of the cottage, the leather-bound volume heavy in his hands. Through the eastern window, he could see the lighthouse beam beginning its nightly rotation. That sweeping arc of light that was no longer simply light. He should leave. The rational part of his mind insisted upon it with increasing urgency. Contact the board. Claim illness. Abandon this place to its secrets. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't. Because Torrance had been right about one thing. The correction, once begun, could not be undone. Hugh climbed the stairs to the lens room. The sea was crowded tonight, more populated than he'd yet seen it. Ghost ships moved in stately procession, their phantom crews working rigging and tending wheels on vessels that had been splinters for centuries. But it was the other things that drew his attention. The entities that pulsed and writhed in the deeper waters, their forms suggesting dimensions his mind struggled to process. And they were closer now. Definitely closer. One surfaced, directly in the lighthouse beam, rising from depths that seemed to extend beyond the physical ocean floor. It was vast, its body, if body it could be called, composed of surfaces that reflected light in impossible ways, casting shadows in directions that violated Euclidean geometry. Appendages that might have been tentacles, or might have been something for which language had no word extended from its central mass, each one terminating in a structure that resembled an eye. And those eyes were looking at him. Hugh felt the regard like a physical pressure. The entity's attention was not hostile exactly, but it possessed a quality of intense scrutiny that made him feel transparent, examine, catalog. It studied him with the same clinical interest he might apply to a specimen under a microscope, which he realized with the creeping horror was precisely what he had become. By looking into the lens, by allowing the correction of his vision, he had made himself visible to things that should remain forever unaware of humanity's existence. The entity moved closer to the lighthouse, its form undulating through the spectral water. Hugh watched, paralyzed, as it extended something that might have been a limb or might have been a sense organ toward the tower. It seemed to be testing the boundary, probing the membrane between its reality and his. And then, with a sensation like a soap bubble bursting, it broke through. The lens room filled with a presence that was not quite physical. Hugh felt it as a pressure change, as a distortion in the air itself. The temperature dropped precipitously, his breath misting before him. The instruments lining the walls began to tick irregularly, their mechanisms responding to forces they were never designed to measure. The entity existed now in both worlds simultaneously, partially manifested in Hugh's reality, while remaining anchored in its own. It occupied the space around the lighthouse like water filling a container, pressing against the stone walls with patient persistence. Through the windows, Hugh could see its form wrapping around the tower, studying the structure with those terrible eyes. He understood with a sudden, absolute clarity. It was learning the architecture of this world, the physics that govern material existence, the nature of the barrier it had just breached. And once it understood, once it had mapped the boundaries and identified the weaknesses, others would follow. Hugh's hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching for the mechanism that controlled the lens. There must be a way to stop this, to reverse what had been done. But as his fingers touched the brass housing, he felt the entity's attention shift fully to him. It looked into him, the way he had looked into the sea, with piercing, analytical regard. It examined the structure of his thoughts, the architecture of his consciousness, the patterns of fear and curiosity that defined his mind. And in that moment of terrible intimacy, Hugh understood something that Torrance had perhaps understood before him. The entity was not hostile. It was not invading, not attacking, not threatening. It was simply exploring, seeking to understand this adjacent world with the same innocent curiosity that a child might display when discovering a new room in a familiar house. The danger lay not in its intention, but in its nature. It existed according to laws fundamentally incompatible with physical reality. Its presence here was not malicious, but it was corrosive, caustic, like strong acid eating through thin fabric. Where it touched the world changed. Hugh could see it now, subtle distortions spreading from the point of manifestation. The stones of the lighthouse tower were developing strange angles, their edges bending in directions that hurt to perceive. The air itself was taking on a crystalline quality, as though space were solidifying into structures that followed geometric principles from another dimension entirely. And he could feel it happening to himself as well. His perception was continuing to refine, to correct, to sharpen. He was seeing more with each passing moment, seeing the infrastructure of reality, the framework upon which the physical world was draped like a theater curtain. Behind the curtain, an infinity of adjacent spaces pressed close, each one populated by entities that had evolved in conditions radically different from Earth's. The lighthouse, he understood now, had been built on a weak point, a place where the fabric separating realities was already dangerously thin, and the lens had been designed not merely to observe the other side, but to maintain watch, to provide early warning if anything attempted to cross over. It was a sentinel's post, a guard tower on the border between worlds. But Torrance had failed in his duty. By looking too long, by studying the entities too intently, he had weakened the barrier further. His focused attention had been like a spotlight illuminating a locked door. It showed the way to those who might be looking for it. And now Hugh had done the same. The entity withdrew slightly, its form rippling with what might have been satisfaction. It had learned what it came to learn. It understood now the nature of the passage, the mechanisms of crossing, the structure of the world beyond its own. And as it slipped back through the membrane into its native dimension, Hugh saw others approaching. Dozens of them, hundreds, drawn by the knowledge that a bridge had been opened, however briefly. They gathered in the waters around the lighthouse, circling with patient interest. They were not hostile, but they were relentless. They had discovered something new, a frontier to explore, and they would return again and again, testing the barrier, studying the passage, learning more with each attempt. Hugh stood in the lens room as dawn approached, watching that terrible congregation. The ghost ships continued their eternal circuits, oblivious to the gathering below them. But the entities, the true entities, the ones that existed in dimensions adjacent to time, those pressed closer with each passing hour. He descended the stairs at first light, retrieved Torrance's notebook, and began to write his own entry in the margins. I understand now why a keeper must remain. Not to maintain the light. The mechanism is automated, requires no human hand, but to watch, to observe, to bear witness to what gathers in the waters around this tower. The lens corrects vision, allows one to see the full spectrum of reality. And once corrected, one cannot unsee. I perceive them now at all times, when I close my eyes, when I turn away, when I try to sleep. They are always there, always present, separated from our world by a boundary that grows thinner each time one crosses over. Torrance fled, but I suspect it did him no good. Once you have been seen by them, truly seen, you carry that awareness with you. You become a beacon, a marker in the dark. They remember you. They watch for you. Distance means nothing to entities that exist outside conventional space. So I remain. Not from duty to the board, which knows nothing of the lens's true purpose, but from duty to a principle older and more necessary. Someone must watch. Someone must maintain the vigil. Someone must stand at the border and record what gathers there, what presses against the barrier, what seeks passage into our narrower, simpler world. The question is not whether they will find a way through. They already have. I witnessed it tonight. The question is, what happens when they do so in numbers, when enough of them manifest simultaneously that the cumulative strain on reality becomes too great? I will continue to watch. I will document what I see. And perhaps, when I can no longer maintain the vigil, when the correction has progressed so far that I can no longer distinguish this world from theirs, someone else will come. Someone else will take up the watch. Because the alternative, leaving this post unmanned, abandoning the Sentinel's duty, is unthinkable. These entities are not evil, but they are other. Profoundly, fundamentally other. And if they cross over in force, if they establish a true bridgehead in our reality, the changes they bring will be absolute. So I watch, and I wait, and I record what I see here at the edge of the world, where the light reveals what should remain hidden, where the correction of vision becomes a curse and a calling. The lens continues to rotate. The beam sweeps the waters. The entities gather below. And I bear witness. Hugh closed the notebook and returned it to its hiding place. Through the cottage window, he could see the lighthouse tower rising against the morning sky, its stone solid and dependable in daylight. But he knew what surrounded it, knew what pressed against the barrier of reality with patient, inhuman persistence. The supply boat would arrive in 2 weeks. Dockery would ask if he wished to return to the mainland, and Hugh would refuse. Because someone had to remain. Someone had to watch. Someone had to stand at the border and maintain the vigil over what gathered in those deep waters. He climbed the stairs to the lens room, pulled a chair close to the windows, and settled himself to wait for nightfall. When darkness came, he would look again into the beam. He would observe what crossed over, what tested the barrier, what sought passage into this narrower world. He would watch and record and bear witness, because that was the keeper's true duty. Not to tend the light, but to see what the light revealed. Not to guide ships away from rocks, but to maintain surveillance over the rocks themselves. Those fundamental structures where one reality pressed against another, where the boundaries between worlds wore thin as mist. The correction was complete. He understood now. And understanding, he could not look away. Days merged into weeks, measured only by the arrival of the supply boat and the gradual deterioration of Hugh's handwriting in the logbook. He ate mechanically, slept in brief intervals, spent his waking hours either watching the waters or writing his observations. The notebook filled with sketches and diagrams, attempts to capture in two-dimensional space the geometries he witnessed in the beam. The entities grew bolder, or perhaps his perception sharpened further, allowing him to see their movements with greater clarity. They approached the lighthouse in organized patterns now, moving in formations that suggested intelligence and purpose. They were studying the barrier systematically, testing it at different points, different times, under different atmospheric conditions. He observed 3 more crossings in the following month. Each time, an entity managed to manifest partially in his reality, occupying the space around the lighthouse for anywhere from a few minutes to nearly an hour before withdrawing. With each crossing, the distortions persisted longer. Subtle warps in the stone, impossible reflections in the windows, temperatures that fluctuated independent of weather. The lighthouse itself was changing. Hugh noticed it first in small details. The spiral stairs developed curves that seemed too steep in some sections, too shallow in others. The lens room's circular walls no longer appeared quite circular, though he couldn't identify exactly where they deviated from the expected geometry. The beam itself began to display colors at the edges of the spectrum, ultraviolet glimmers and infrared shadows that his corrected vision could now perceive. He wrote it all down in meticulous detail. Future keepers would need to know what to expect, how to recognize the signs of breach, what precautions to take. Though even as he wrote, he suspected that anyone who took up this post would undergo the same correction, would develop the same terrible clarity of vision that made every moment an exercise in controlled horror. Because the entities were not the worst part. Hugh had grown almost accustomed to their presence, had learned to recognize individual specimens by their particular geometries. What disturbed him more profoundly were the moments when he glimpsed other things, fleeting suggestions of realities even more remote, dimensions so alien that his corrected vision could barely register them before recoiling. The entities that circled the lighthouse were merely the nearest neighbors, the ones that existed in conditions similar enough to Earth's that crossover was possible. But beyond them, in spaces more distant, he tried not to think about what lay in those further dimensions. He focused instead on his immediate duty, observation and documentation. The supply boat came and went. Dockery no longer attempted conversation, simply delivered the provisions in grim silence and departed before the sun reached its zenith. Hugh suspected he looked different now. Thinner, certainly, but also changed in less tangible ways. His eyes had developed a particular quality of distance, as though he were always looking through the present moment into some deeper layer of reality. On a night in late autumn, 3 months after his arrival, Hugh witnessed the first sustained manifestation. An entity, one he'd come to recognize by its particular configuration, a thing like a flower constructed of crystalline planes, crossed over and remained. It didn't withdraw after an hour or 2 or 3. Instead, it began to interact with the physical world in increasingly sophisticated ways. It learned to affect matter directly. Hugh watched through the lens room windows as it manipulated the sea, raising columns of water that defied gravity, sculpting them into shapes that hurt to perceive. It experimented with the air, creating visible currents that moved according to principles unrelated to wind. It touched the lighthouse stones and left impressions. Not marks exactly, but alterations in the structure itself, as though the rock remembered the entity's presence and couldn't quite return to its previous configuration. This was the moment, Hugh understood, when a keeper should act, should take some measure to prevent the manifestations from stabilizing, from establishing a permanent presence in this world. But he didn't know what such measures might entail. Torrance's notebook contained no instructions for intervention, only observation. The order that had installed the lens had apparently believed that documentation alone was sufficient. Or perhaps they had known that intervention was impossible. That once an entity managed sustained crossing, the keeper's only option was to record the event for whatever future use such knowledge might serve. So Hugh watched. He documented. He filled page after page with descriptions of the entity's experiments, his growing facility with the manipulation of matter, its systematic exploration of physical law. And as he watched, he became aware that the entity was learning not just about the world, but about him. It began to mirror his actions. When he moved to one window, it shifted position to remain in his line of sight. When he retreated down the stairs, it flowed around the lighthouse to appear in the cottage windows. It was studying him with the same intensity he applied to it, learning the patterns of human behavior, the rhythms of consciousness, the nature of the observer who watched from behind the corrected lens. One night, it formed something like a limb and pressed it against the lens room window. The glass distorted where it touched, developing a quality of translucence it shouldn't possess. Hugh approached cautiously, keeping the width of the room between himself and the window. Through the distorted glass, he could see the entity's eye, or the organ that served it as an eye, watching him with what might have been curiosity or might have been something for which he had no name. They regarded each other across the barrier, observer and observed, human and entity, consciousness shaped by evolution in radically different spaces. And in that moment of mutual regard, Hugh felt something shift in his understanding. The entities weren't invading. They weren't threatening or hostile. They were exploring, yes, but more than that, they were curious. They had existed for eons in their own dimensions, perhaps unaware that other realities lay adjacent to their own. And then the lens had been created, had opened a window, had shown them that they were not alone in the infinite manifold of space. Of course, they pressed close to investigate. Of course, they tested the boundaries and sought passage. What conscious being, in discovering evidence of other worlds, wouldn't attempt to make contact? The horror, Hugh realized, lay not in their intention, but in their nature. They couldn't help being incompatible with this reality. They couldn't help that their presence corroded the barriers between dimensions. They were simply what they were, as innocent and as terrible as a force of nature. And he was the keeper, the watcher, the witness to this meeting of incompatible realities. The entity withdrew its limb from the window. The glass slowly returned to its normal state, though a faint distortion remained, a memory of contact that wouldn't quite fade. The entity itself moved back into the water, submerging into depths that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But it didn't leave. Even after it descended beyond the range of his corrected vision, Hugh could feel its presence. It had established some kind of anchor here, some connection to this world that persisted independent of physical manifestation. It would return. And when it did, it would be more skilled at crossing over, more adept at manipulating the physics of this reality. Hugh descended the stairs and added another entry to his log. The manifestations are becoming permanent, not continuous but recurring. The same entities returning again and again, each time more practiced at the crossing. They are learning our world structure, adapting to its constraints, finding ways to maintain presence despite the fundamental incompatibility of their nature with ours. I no longer believe the lens was created solely for observation. I think it was meant as a test to determine whether such entities existed, whether they could perceive the window open for them, whether they would attempt to cross. And we have our answer. They do exist. They can perceive, and they will cross. The question now is, what comes next? What happens when they've learned enough to maintain permanent manifestation? What happens when more of them follow, drawn by the knowledge that passage is possible? What happens when the lighthouse at Beacon's End becomes a beacon indeed? A signal fire marking the way to a world they never knew existed. I cannot answer these questions. I can only watch and record, and hope that someone wiser than I will eventually read these words and understand what must be done, if anything can be done, if the opening of the window hasn't already set in motion a process that cannot be reversed. The correction continues. My vision sharpens daily. I see more now than I ever wanted to see. The framework of reality itself, the thin places where dimensions press together, the vast population of entities that exist just beyond human perception. And I understand now that we have always been surrounded, always been watched, always existed in ignorance of the true nature of the cosmos. The lens doesn't create this truth. It merely reveals it. And once revealed, it cannot be forgotten, cannot be unseen, cannot be escaped. I remain at my post. I maintain the vigil. But I no longer know if I am protecting our world from theirs or simply recording the final days before the barrier falls completely. Winter came to Beacon's End. The seas grew rough. The skies darkened early, and the lighthouse beam cut through sleet and fog with the same remorseless precision. Hugh's supplies dwindled, but he barely noticed. He ate little, slept less, spent his hours in the lens room, watching the growing congregation in the waters below. More entities arrived daily. They came from distances he couldn't calculate, following paths through dimensions he couldn't name. They gathered around the lighthouse in a formation that might have been a crowd, or might have been a queue, waiting their turn to approach the barrier, to test the crossing, to probe the membrane between worlds. The ghost ships still followed their eternal routes, but they seemed insubstantial now compared to the solid reality of the entities. Hugh understood that the ghosts were echoes, after images of human activity persisting in the subtle dimensions adjacent to material space. But the entities were alive, were present, were actively engaging with the barrier in ways that the dead could never manage. He recognized individuals now. The crystalline flower thing that had made first sustained contact. A being like a spiral of planes that rotated through angles beyond three-dimensional space. Something that resembled a tree if trees grew according to fractal mathematics and possessed consciousness. They approached in sequence, each taking its turn at the barrier, each experimenting with different methods of crossing. And they were succeeding more frequently. The barrier was weakening, worn thin by repeated contact, eroded by the cumulative strain of too many attempted crossings. Hugh could see the deterioration with his corrected vision, hairline fractures in the fabric of space, thin spots where reality seemed translucent, weak points where the membrane between dimensions had worn gossamer thin. It would fail eventually, perhaps soon, perhaps already failing in ways too subtle for even his enhanced perception to detect. And when it failed, when the barrier finally gave way under the accumulated pressure, what then? Hugh found he didn't fear it as much as he perhaps should. The correction had progressed beyond fear. He simply watched with the clinical interest, documenting each new development, each incremental weakening of the boundary, each successful crossing. On the solstice, the longest night of the year, something changed. The entities had been gathering in formation all day, dozens of them, arranged in a pattern too complex for him to fully perceive. As darkness fell and the lighthouse beam began its rotation, they moved in concert. It was coordinated, deliberate. A collective action rather than individual experimentation. They pressed against the barrier simultaneously. Hugh felt it give way. Not completely, not catastrophically, but definitively. A breach opened. Larger than any before, more stable, self-sustaining. And through it, the entities began to flow. They manifested in the waters around the lighthouse, occupying space that had contained only ordinary sea moments before. Hugh watched from the lens room as they emerged. First one, then three, then a dozen, each one bringing with it distortions in the fundamental structure of reality. The sea itself changed. The water took on properties it shouldn't possess, reflective qualities that showed images of places that didn't exist in this world. movements that followed currents unrelated to tide or wind. The air temperature fluctuated wildly, responding to principles of thermodynamics that didn't apply in normal space. The lighthouse tower groaned as its stones adjusted to forces they were never designed to withstand. And the entities began to explore. They moved through the sea with careful deliberation, examining everything they encountered. They studied the rocks, the lighthouse structure, the quality of air and water. They experimented with matter, learning to manipulate it in increasingly sophisticated ways. They communicated with each other through means Hugh's human mind couldn't quite grasp. Pulses of something that wasn't light, ripples in something that wasn't space. They were colonizing, establishing a beachhead, creating conditions in which more of their kind could manifest comfortably. Hugh descended the stairs for what he suspected would be the final time. His body was failing. The correction had progressed so far that his physical form was struggling to maintain coherence in a world he perceived as increasingly unreal. He moved through spaces that seemed to shift around him, descended stairs that curved in directions they shouldn't, opened doors to rooms that didn't quite match his memory of them. He reached the cottage and sat at the desk. Torrance's notebook lay open before him, but his own hand was shaking too badly to write. Instead, he simply sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds outside. The splash of water that moved according to alien principles, the hum of air displaced by entities experimenting with their new environment, the creak of lighthouse stones adjusting to geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Dawn came, but it brought no comfort. In daylight, with his fully corrected vision, Hugh could see the entities clearly. They surrounded the lighthouse in their dozens, their forms solid and undeniable in the morning light. They had crossed over permanently. They were here. He made his way outside, moving with the careful steps of a man navigating unfamiliar territory. The lighthouse grounds looked the same. Stones, scrub grass, the rocky shore. But he could see the alterations spreading outward from the tower. Reality was rewriting itself around the point of breach, accommodating the presence of entities that existed according to different fundamental laws. One of them, the crystalline flower, the first to make sustained contact, approached across the rocks. It moved with a grace that his mind struggled to process, flowing over obstacles according to principles of motion that had nothing to do with gravity or inertia. It stopped a few yards distant, and Hugh felt its attention settle on him. They regarded each other in silence. The entity studied him with an intensity that made his skin crawl despite everything he'd witnessed. And then it did something that shattered his carefully maintained composure. It mimicked him. The crystalline planes shifted, rearranged, and for one terrible moment, Hugh was looking at a reflection of his own face rendered in alien geometry. Not a perfect copy. The proportions were subtly wrong, the angles slightly off, but recognizable enough to trigger a primal revulsion. The entity was showing him what it had learned. It had studied him so thoroughly that it could reproduce the architecture of human form. And if it could copy the external structure, what else had it learned to replicate? The false face dissolved back into crystalline abstraction. The entity extended something toward him. Not a limb exactly, but a projection of itself, a tendril reaching across the space between them. Hugh understood with sudden, nauseating clarity what it offered. Not communication, but consumption. A sharing of consciousness that would allow it to map the interior landscape of human thought as thoroughly as it had mapped the exterior form. He should refuse, should run. But his corrected vision showed him the futility. They surrounded the lighthouse in their dozens, and more approached from the deeper waters. There was nowhere to flee that they couldn't follow, no distance he could put between himself and what they had become through his observation of them. And beneath the fear, a terrible curiosity compelled him. He had watched them for months, had documented their movements, studied their forms, analyzed their behavior. The scientist in him, the part that had never quite died despite everything, needed to know. Needed to understand what would happen when the boundary between human and entity finally dissolved completely. Hugh reached out and touched the tendril. The world didn't invert. It shattered. Pain exploded through his consciousness. Not physical pain, but something worse. The agony of a mind trying to contain information it was never designed to process. The entity poured its awareness into him, and Hugh felt his thoughts fragmenting under the onslaught of incompatible knowledge. He saw their world, not as a tourist glimpsing foreign lands, but as a native inhabitant, with all the crushing weight of existential understanding that implied. He perceived spaces that folded through 12 dimensions, time that flowed in directions unrelated to causality, consciousness that existed as distributed patterns across geometries his human brain kept trying to flatten into comprehensible shapes. And in trying to flatten them, his mind broke. The entity wasn't hostile. That was the horror of it. It was simply showing him what it was, sharing its nature with the same innocent directness a child might use to show a favorite toy. But Hugh's consciousness couldn't contain that truth. The human brain, evolved to navigate three-dimensional space and linear time, simply wasn't equipped to house awareness of 12-dimensional reality. He felt his sense of self dissolving. The boundaries that defined Hugh Fortescue as distinct from the universe around him were artificial constructs. He understood now. Convenient fictions maintained by a limited perceptual apparatus. The entity had no such boundaries. It existed as a node in an infinite network of consciousness, individual and collective, simultaneously. And now, so did he. But where the entity's mind had evolved for this state, Hugh's was being forcibly restructured. Poorly. Incompletely. Like forcing a two-dimensional drawing to become a three-dimensional object. The original structure warped and twisted beyond recognition in the translation. The connection withdrew. Hugh found himself standing on the rocky shore, his hands still extended toward empty air, but he wasn't standing straight. His body had forgotten how to balance in merely 3 dimensions, and he wasn't seeing the shore, not really. He was seeing through it, into it, around it, perceiving the substrate of reality that underlay the illusion of solid matter. His mind screamed for the simplicity of ordinary vision, for the merciful limitation of human perception. But the correction couldn't be undone. He would see this way forever now, would perceive the truth behind the veil for whatever remained of his sanity. Which wouldn't be long. Hugh stumbled toward the cottage, moving through a world that no longer made sense. The ground beneath his feet existed in more dimensions than he had legs to walk on. The air around him was populated by entities he hadn't noticed before, smaller things, simpler things, that had always been there, but invisible to uncorrected eyes. They congregated around him like dimensional static clinging to a fracture in reality, drawn not by hunger, but by the simple fact of his instability. He climbed the stairs to the lens room, though his mind struggled to understand why stairs were necessary when he could perceive that the upper room and lower room occupied the same point, in a dimension perpendicular to the 3 he'd spent his life navigating. At the desk, he opened the logbook. His hand shook violently, and the pen kept sliding across dimensions his fingers couldn't quite grasp. But he forced himself to write. The next keeper needed to understand, needed to know what awaited them. But as his hand moved across the page, Hugh realized with mounting horror that he wasn't writing a warning. The words that flowed from his pen spoke of wonder, of invitation, of the magnificent opportunity to perceive reality's true nature. They welcomed the next keeper to undergo the correction, to embrace the gift of extended vision, to join in the great work of watching and witnessing. No, that wasn't what he meant to write. He tried to stop, tried to force his hand to pen a warning instead. Destroy the lens, flee this place, never look into the beam. But his hand continued its steady script, covering page after page with reassurances and encouragements that made his remaining shred of human consciousness recoil in disgust. The entity hadn't just shared its awareness. It had planted something deeper, a compulsion. A program running beneath his conscious control that ensured he would serve its purpose even as his human mind screamed in protest. He was bait now, a lure. His final logbook entry would draw the next keeper into the same trap, and they would undergo the same shattering correction, and they would write the same false reassurances for whoever came after. Hugh watched his hand write, "The correction is a gift. Do not fear what you will see. The entities mean no harm. They are simply other, and in understanding otherness, we transcend our limitations." Inside, his true consciousness howled, tried to make his other hand reach for the pen, to knock it away, to smash the inkwell, to tear out the pages. But that hand wouldn't respond. It hung limp at his side while his right hand continued its treacherous work. Watch the lens. Look into the beam. Allow your vision to correct. Welcome the entities when they come. Touch them. Learn from them. Become like them. No, destroy the lens. Run. Save yourself. But his voice wouldn't work anymore either. His throat produced only a low whine, a sound like wind through broken stone. The entity had claimed the parts of him that could warn, could resist, could interfere with its purpose. It had left only the parts that would serve, the hand that could write, the eyes that could see, the mind that could witness its own corruption. The final entry complete, Hugh signed his name in a hand that looked nothing like his own writing. The entity guided him to stand, to move to the window, to look out at the gathering below. More of them now, dozens more. They had learned the technique, how to cross over, how to establish stable presence, how to use corrected human consciousness as an anchor point for manifestation. The breach was widening. Soon it wouldn't need human observers at all. Soon this world's physics would adjust enough to accommodate them permanently. And humanity would never understand what was happening, would never recognize the invasion for what it was, because it wasn't conquest by force. It was displacement through incompatibility. The entities didn't need to destroy humans. They just needed to exist in the same space. Their presence alone would warp reality until nothing that evolved for three-dimensional existence could survive. Hugh tried to scream, but his vocal cords produced only a thin, whistling sound. Tried to move toward the mechanism, to smash the lens, to end the beacon that called them. But his body turned instead toward the stairs, began its descent to wait on the shore. The supply boat would arrive in 3 days. A new keeper would step onto the rocks, eager and curious, armed with scientific training and steady nerves, and a complete ignorance of what the lens truly was. And Hugh would greet them, would show them to the cottage, would explain the duties, would ensure they climbed those stairs and looked into that terrible correcting beam. His human consciousness. The part that was still Hugh Fortescue, still capable of horror and despair, would watch helplessly as his body performed these actions, would scream voicelessly as another mind was shattered and reprogrammed. would witness the cycle perpetuating itself, keeper after keeper, each one becoming another anchor point for entities that had no concept of the devastation in their presence caused. This was the truth Torrance had understood in his final moments. This was why he'd fled. The flight was futile once the correction was complete. The lens didn't reveal a hidden world. It recruited soldiers for an invasion the victims couldn't even recognize as hostile. 3 days until the boat arrived. 72 hours during which Hugh Fortescue's consciousness would remain trapped in a body that no longer answered to him, watching through eyes that saw too much, waiting to betray the next keeper the way he had been betrayed. The entities moved closer, their forms solid in the morning lights. They surrounded him now, studying him with satisfaction. He had served his purpose perfectly, had documented everything, had undergone complete correction, had written the invitation that would doom the next keeper. And there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming. The lens continued to rotate, its beam sweeping across waters crowded with entities pressing toward the breach. The ghost ships moved through them like shadows, unaware that they shared the sea with something far more terrible than mere memories of death. The lighthouse stood on its rock, a beacon calling across the dimensional void. And Hugh stood on the shore, a puppet, awaiting its next performance, a trap that looked like a man. Inside, he screamed. Outside, he smiled. The correction was complete. Story 4. Gordon Fitch would later calculate that he had spent 11 minutes talking to Ned Coyle before revealing that no one knew where he was. 11 minutes of pleasantries about fishing and weather and the way light held on the reservoir at dusk. 11 minutes during which Ned had offered nothing about himself except a name and a smile and a stringer of the trout, while Gordon, lonely, flattered, softened by attention he hadn't known he craved, had handed over the coordinates of his own disappearance. But that was later. That was after. The trip itself had been an impulse, or what Gordon told himself was an impulse. In truth, he had been circling the idea for months, ever since the divorce was finalized and the apartment in Westchester sublet, and the leave of absence from the accounting firm approved with the kind of gentle concern that suggested his colleagues expected him never to return. He had visited Pepacton Reservoir once before, 23 years ago, with his father. He remembered almost nothing of that trip except the quality of the silence in a stand of white pines that had seemed, to his 11-year-old perception, impossibly tall. His father had been dead for 9 years now. A heart attack at 61 mid-sentence, reaching for the salt at a family dinner. Gordon had been the one to catch him as he slumped, had felt the precise moment when his father's weight shifted from living to dead. He had never told anyone about that moment. The way the body had seemed to become heavier in his arms, as though death added something rather than took it away. Gordon was 44 now, newly alone in a way that felt less like freedom than amputation. And he had convinced himself that returning to Pepacton Reservoir would provide some nameless restoration. He had not asked himself what, exactly, he expected to find there. He had learned in recent months that asking himself questions led to answers he didn't want. The drive-up had taken longer than expected. Gordon had forgotten how to read paper maps, an embarrassing admission for a man his age, and the GPS signal had dissolved somewhere around Arkville. He'd pulled over twice to study the Christ Delorme atlas he'd found in a box of his father's effects, feeling ridiculous and also unexpectedly moved. His father's handwriting in the margins. Good fishing here. Watch the current. A coffee ring on the corner of page 47, preserved for decades like a fossil. Gordon had sat in the car for several minutes, his thumb tracing the ring's circumference before he trusted himself to drive again. He arrived at the campground past 4 in the afternoon, later than he'd planned. The ranger's station was closed, but the self-registration system was straightforward enough. Fill out the envelope, insert the fee, tear off the stub, place it on your dashboard. Gordon selected a site near the water, away from the 2 other vehicles he could see in the lot. A rust-colored pickup and an older Subaru with Vermont plates. He wanted solitude. He had driven 4 hours to escape the silence that came with other people's company, the way conversations required him to perform a version of himself he no longer believed in. Janet had accused him, near the end, of being absent, even when he was present. She had been right about many things, but this accusation had stung because it was true. Gordon had spent years perfecting the art of appearing to listen, while his mind wandered to spreadsheets, to baseball statistics, to the way light fell through their kitchen window at 7:15 on winter mornings. He had been married to Janet for 11 years, and he could not now recall a single conversation they'd had in the last 5. He remembered her voice, the cadence of her complaints, but the words themselves had dissolved like sugar in water. The campsite was adequate. A fire ring, a picnic table, with 1 warped plank, a flat area for his tent. Through the trees he could see the reservoir, its surface holding the late afternoon light like hammered pewter. Gordon assembled his tent with the methodical precision he applied to everything, checking each pole, consulting the instructions, despite having done this perhaps 50 times in his life. Janet had always mocked this tendency. "You're not diffusing a bomb, Gordon." But he had never been able to explain to her that the checking wasn't about the tent. It was about the checking itself. The comfort of a procedure followed correctly. The small satisfaction of competence in a world that increasingly seemed to reward only chaos. He just started gathering kindling when he heard footsteps on the trail. The man who emerged from the tree line was perhaps 50, but the kind of weathered face that could have belonged to a laborer or an outdoorsman, or simply someone who had spent too many years squinting into the sun. He wore a faded canvas jacket, the kind that cost $300 new but looked better after a decade of use, and carried a tackle box in one hand and a stringer of fish in the other. His smile was immediate and unguarded, the smile of someone who had never learned to distrust strangers. He introduced himself as Ned Coyle, a regular at Pepicton who knew every inch of the place. Gordon offered his own name and watched Ned's handshake, firm but not aggressive, the handshake of someone who understood that such rituals were performative and saw no reason to perform dominance. There was something in the man's eyes, a quality of attention, that made Gordon feel seen in a way he found both flattering and faintly unsettling. Most people, in Gordon's experience, were not genuinely interested in others. They waited for their turn to speak. When Ned lifted the stringer of trout and offered to share dinner, Gordon's instinct was to decline. He had come here specifically to avoid human contact, to sit alone with his thoughts until they became bearable, or at least familiar. But something in Ned's manner made refusal feel churlish, and Gordon was aware that he had eaten nothing since a rubbery egg sandwich at a rest stop outside Poughkeepsie. "Site 12, Ned said. Just past the split oak. An hour or so." He disappeared back into the trees with the easy gait of someone who knew exactly where he was going and saw no reason to hurry. Gordon stood for a moment watching the space where he'd been, feeling as though something had been decided without his participation. The hour passed slowly. Gordon tried to read. He had brought a biography of Eisenhower that Janet had given him 3 Christmases ago, still unfinished. But the words slid off his mind like water off glass. He kept thinking about Ned's eyes, the way they had seemed to take in everything about Gordon in a single glance. The newness of his camping gear, the softness of his hands, the slouch of a man who spent his days hunched over a computer. Gordon was not vain, had never been vain, but he found himself wondering what Ned had seen, what conclusions he had drawn. At 6 o'clock, Gordon walked to Site 12. Ned's campsite was more established than Gordon's, with the comfortable disorder of someone who had been there for several days at least. A tarp stretched between two trees, a camp chair with a cup holder, a cooler that hummed faintly with some kind of battery-powered mechanism. 2 tents, Gordon noticed. One larger, one small. The smaller one set back from the fire ring, half obscured by brush. "Storage," Ned explained, waving a hand. He brought too much gear, couldn't help himself. His father had been the same way, always prepared for contingencies that never arrived. I think it's a form of optimism, actually. Believing you'll need the backup flashlight, the extra tarp. Believing you'll be out here long enough for things to go wrong. The fish were already sizzling in a cast iron pan, their skins crisping in butter, and something aromatic. Thyme, perhaps, or sage. Ned had set out 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 bottles of beer sweating in the evening air. The presumption implicit in this preparation could have felt intrusive, but somehow it didn't. It felt instead like consideration. Like Ned had understood that Gordon would come before Gordon himself had known. Gordon settled into the offered chair and, without quite meaning to, began to talk. He talked about the accounting firm, about the tedium of forensic auditing. The way his days consisted of searching for patterns in data, for the small discrepancies that indicated fraud or error. He had been good at it once, had taken satisfaction in the detective work. But somewhere along the way, the satisfaction had curdled into something else. Now he saw patterns everywhere, even where none existed. He saw deception in innocent spreadsheets, malice in clerical errors. Janet had told him he was becoming paranoid. He had told her she didn't understand. Ned listened. That was the thing Gordon would remember later, would turn over in his mind during the sleepless nights that followed. Ned listened in a way that made Gordon feel, for the first time in years, that what he was saying mattered. There were no interruptions, no attempts to redirect the conversation, no glazed expressions or fidgeting, just attention, pure and complete, as though Gordon's words were the most interesting thing Ned had ever heard. The divorce was finalized 2 months ago, Gordon heard himself say. He had not planned to mention this. 11 years, and in the end it came down to paperwork. Signatures on a line. I kept waiting to feel something, grief, relief, anything, but there was just nothing. Like I'd already used up all my feelings somewhere else, and there weren't any left. Emotional bankruptcy, Ned said. I know the condition. I've had it myself. What cured it? Ned smiled, and Gordon noticed for the first time that one of his incisors was slightly gray, dead or dying. I stopped trying to feel what I thought I should feel. Started paying attention to what was actually in front of me instead of what I'd lost. People, mostly. Strangers. Everyone has a story, Gordon. Everyone has something they're carrying. You just have to be willing to see it. The fish was exceptional. Better than anything Gordon had eaten in recent memory. He said so, and Ned waved off the compliment, with the ease of someone who had heard it before and no longer needed validation. A flask of whiskey appeared. Good whiskey. Better than Gordon would have expected. And they passed it back and forth as the stars emerged. Ned knew the constellations and knew the history of the reservoir. Built in the 1950s, he explained, to supply water to New York City. Several small towns had been drowned in the process. Communities that had existed for generations submerged beneath 60 feet of water. There's a church down there still, Ned said. A general store. Houses where people raised families. Sometimes when the water level drops in a drought, you can see the tops of the chimneys. Gordon tried to imagine it. An entire town preserved beneath the surface, slowly decaying in the cold, dark water. Fish swimming through doorways, silt accumulating on kitchen tables where families had once eaten breakfast. "Does that bother you?" he asked. "Fishing in a place like that? Why would it bother me? The history? The loss?" Ned considered this. The firelight played across his features, softening the weathered lines of his face. "Loss is everywhere, Gordon. Every place you've ever been has a history of loss. People who lived there before you, who died or moved away or were displaced. You can either let that paralyze you, or you can learn to see it as continuity. I'm part of the story now. So are you. So was everyone who came before us and everyone who will come after." It was a strange kind of comfort, but Gordon felt it nonetheless. The sense that his own small life, his own small losses, were part of something larger. That the grief he couldn't seem to feel for Janet, for his father, for the man he used to be, was not a failure, but simply a different way of being connected to the world. "What about you?" Gordon asked. "What are you carrying?" Ned's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something that might have been amusement or might have been assessment. Same as everyone. Regrets, memories, the faces of people I should have treated better. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a spray of sparks. I try to make up for it now, being kind to strangers. You never know what someone's going through. You never know when a small gesture might matter more than you realize. At some point, Gordon couldn't say precisely when, he realized he was drunk. Not incapacitated, but pleasantly blurred, his edges softened. The walk back to his campsite seemed longer than it should have been, and twice he stumbled over roots that he could have sworn weren't there on the way out. Ned materialized beside him. Gordon hadn't realized Ned was walking him back. "Sleep well, Gordon," Ned said, his hand warm and steadying on Gordon's shoulder. "I'm glad you came." Gordon woke at 3:17 a.m. with his bladder aching and his head wrapped in the thick gauze of a hangover. He lay still for a moment, listening. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant cars. Just the blood moving through his own veins, loud as a river in the dark. He unzipped the tent and stepped out into the night. The moon had set, but the stars provided enough light to see by once his eyes adjusted. The reservoir was a black mirror, reflecting nothing. Gordon urinated against a tree, watching the steam rise from the ground, and was about to return to his tent when he noticed something. A light moving through the trees near Ned's campsite. It was probably nothing. Ned going to the bathroom, same as Gordon, or checking on something in his campsite. There was no reason to feel the prickle of unease that moved across Gordon's shoulders, the primitive warning system that his civilized mind immediately sought to dismiss. But he didn't go back to his tent. Instead, he found himself walking toward the light, stepping carefully to avoid the roots and rocks that seemed to materialize beneath his feet. He told himself he was curious, nothing more. He told himself he wanted to make sure that Ned was all right. But there was another part of him. The part that had spent 20 years searching for patterns, for discrepancies, for the small details that didn't add up, that had noticed something during dinner, something he couldn't quite articulate. Ned had asked a lot of questions. That was normal enough. People asked questions. But Gordon, thinking back, couldn't remember Ned answering any. Every inquiry Gordon had made about Ned's life had been deflected, turned back around, transformed into another question about Gordon, his work, his marriage, his reasons for being here alone. The light had stopped moving. As Gordon drew closer, he could see that it was coming from the smaller tent, the one Ned had called storage. The fabric glowed from within, the shadow of a figure visible against the nylon wall. Gordon stopped. He was close enough now to hear Ned's voice, low and murmuring. There was something wrong with the cadence, something repetitive and conversational that didn't sound like normal speech. It sounded, Gordon thought, like someone talking to himself. Or to someone who couldn't answer. He should leave. He knew he should leave. This was none of his business, and there were 100 innocent explanations. But the unease had crystallized into something harder, colder, and he found himself moving forward again, circling around to the back of the smaller tent, where the zipper was. It was half open. Through the gap, Gordon could see Ned sitting cross-legged on a sleeping pad, a battery lantern casting warm light across the space. Around him, arranged in neat rows like a dealer's inventory at a flea market, were objects that made no immediate sense. Wallets, watches, driver's licenses, photographs, a woman smiling on a hiking trail, a man with a fishing rod holding up a trout, a family portrait, the edges worn from handling, and license plates. At least a dozen of them stacked against the tent wall like records in a collector's crate. Gordon could see the numbers and letters, some from New York, others from Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont. Each one had a small label attached, a strip of masking tape with something written on it. Ned was humming. A tune Gordon almost recognized. Something from the 70s, maybe. Something his mother used to play. In one hand, Ned held a driver's license. In the other, a soft cloth, the kind used for polishing eyeglasses. He was cleaning the license with small, careful strokes, the way a numismatist might handle a rare coin. David Allen Peck, he murmured, conversational as though David were sitting across from him. 41. Organ donor, auburn hair, eyes blue. He held the license up to the light, checking for smudges. Auburn, they wrote. Not brown, not red. Auburn. Someone took their time with you, David. He set the license down in its precise place and selected another from the row. This one was newer, the laminate still glossy. Paula Jean Kretschmer, 38, 5'4", no organ donor. He began to polish, humming again between words. We talked about that, didn't we, Paula? You said you couldn't stand the thought of being taken apart. You said you wanted to be buried whole. The humming continued for a moment, then softly. Well, close enough. Gordon's vision began to narrow, darkness crowding in from the edges. He was aware of his heartbeat, rapid and irregular, and a taste in his mouth like copper. He thought of the questions Ned had asked him. His work, his marriage, whether anyone knew he was here. He had told Ned everything. Had sat by the fire, drunk on whiskey, and the unfamiliar pleasure of being listened to, and told this man his entire life. He took a step backward, and his foot came down on a branch. The snap was impossibly loud in the silence. Ned's head turned toward the sound. The humming stopped. For one terrible moment, Gordon was certain that Ned would rise, would come to the tent flap, would find him standing there in the dark. But the moment passed. Ned was still for several seconds listening, and then he returned to his inventory, selecting another license with the same unhurried care. Gordon ran. He ran without thought, crashing through the underbrush, his breath tearing at his throat. Branches clawed at his face and arms. He fell once, hard, his palms skidding across rocks, and scrambled up without stopping. The darkness was total now, the trees closing around him, and he had no idea if he was going toward his campsite or away from it. He stopped, forced himself to stop. His lungs were burning, his heart slamming against his ribs. He couldn't hear anything over the roar of his own blood, couldn't see anything but the faint shapes of trees against a marginally lighter sky. Think. He had to think. That was what he did, what he was good at. Finding patterns, assessing risks, making calculations when others panicked. His car was at the lot. The lot was... he tried to orient himself south of his campsite, maybe a quarter mile. If he could find the trail, find any trail, he could get to the lot, get to his car, drive until he found a cell signal, or a police station, or anywhere that wasn't here. He started walking, trying to move quietly now, placing each foot with care. The taste of copper was still in his mouth, and he realized he had bitten through his lip at some point during the run. Blood dripped from his chin onto his shirt. How long had Ned been watching him? The thought surfaced unbidden, and Gordon couldn't push it away. The friendliness, the fish, the whiskey, the questions that had seemed so considerate. All of it now reconfigured into something monstrous. Ned had been studying him, taking his measure, deciding whether Gordon Fitch, 44, newly divorced, here alone, no one expecting him home, would be a suitable addition to his collection. Everyone has a story. Everyone has something they're carrying. Gordon's stomach heaved. He braced himself against a tree and vomited, the fish and whiskey coming up in a sour rush. When it was over, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and kept walking. He found the trail almost by accident, his foot catching on the raised edge of a route that had been worn smooth by years of foot traffic. He turned right, south, he was almost certain, and began to walk faster, no longer caring about the noise. Speed mattered more than stealth now. Every second he spent in these woods was a second that Ned could use to find him. The lot materialized out of the darkness like a mirage. Gordon could see his car, the silver Camry, parked where he'd left it. Beyond it, Ned's rust-colored pickup. And beyond that, the road, the blessed road, leading away from this place and towards something resembling safety. He was reaching for his keys when he heard the voice. Gordon. Ned was standing at the edge of the lot, hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted. He looked exactly as he had earlier that evening. Relaxed, curious, faintly benevolent, as though they had simply run into each other on a morning hike. Gordon fumbled with his keys. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped them, and when he bent to retrieve them, he saw Ned take a step forward. Just one step. Patient. You're upset. I understand. The mind plays tricks in the dark, especially after drinking. Strange place, strange sounds. It's easy to see things that aren't there, to misinterpret things that are. Gordon's fingers closed around the keys. He straightened up, pressing the unlock button, hearing the reassuring chirp of his car responding. Ned was closer now, though Gordon hadn't seen him move, just suddenly occupying space that had been empty a moment before. I need to go. If you leave, you'll call the police. They'll come here. And they'll search my things, and they'll ask questions I'd rather not answer. Not because I've done anything wrong, but because I value my privacy. Because some things are sacred and shouldn't be pawed through by strangers. Ned hadn't raised his voice, hadn't changed his posture. He was simply standing between Gordon and the car door, hands still in his pockets, close enough that Gordon could smell wood smoke and fish and something else, something metallic and organic. I would consider that a violation, Gordon, a betrayal, after everything we shared tonight. Gordon's hand was on the door handle. Ned didn't move to stop him. He just stood there watching, his expression one of mild disappointment. A teacher whose favorite student had failed to grasp an obvious lesson. Please don't make this difficult. I like you. I don't want things to become difficult. Gordon yanked the door open, expecting resistance, expecting Ned's hand to shoot out and grab him. But Ned simply stepped aside. The movement was unhurried, almost courteous, like a man holding a door for a stranger. Gordon threw himself into the car, slammed the door, hit the lock. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. Through the window, he could see Ned standing exactly where he'd been. That same expression of patient disappointment on his face. The engine caught on the first try. Thank God, thank God. And Gordon threw it into reverse, spinning the wheels on gravel. As the car swung around, his headlights swept across Ned. The man hadn't moved. He was simply watching, one hand now withdrawn from his pocket, holding something small, a pen. And he was writing, on his palm it looked like, or perhaps a scrap of paper. His eyes never left Gordon's license plate. Gordon floored it. In the rearview mirror, he could see Ned standing in the wash of red taillights, still writing, growing smaller but never looking away. The nearest town was 37 minutes away, according to the GPS, which had finally found a signal somewhere on the winding mountain road. Gordon drove too fast, taking curves at speeds that made his tires squeal, certain at every moment that he would see headlights in his mirror, that the rust-colored pickup would materialize behind him like something out of a nightmare. But the road remained empty. He found a gas station in Margaretville, closed at this hour, but with a payphone. An actual payphone. He hadn't seen one in years. Bolted to the exterior wall. He called 911, his voice shaking so badly that the dispatcher asked him twice to repeat himself. The Delaware County Sheriff's Department sent a deputy to meet him. Gordon told his story, aware of how it sounded. A camping trip. A friendly stranger, wallets and license plates, and names recited in the dark. The deputy took notes, his face revealing nothing. He asked if Gordon had been drinking. Gordon admitted he had. The deputy nodded and told Gordon to go home, get some sleep. They would send someone up to the campground. They would be in touch. Gordon drove home. He arrived at his sublet in Yonkers as the sun was coming up, his hands still trembling, the taste of copper still lingering in his mouth, despite the 3 bottles of water he'd consumed on the drive. He showered, standing under water so hot it turned his skin pink. And then he sat on the couch in his bathrobe and waited for the phone to ring. It rang at 2:47 that afternoon. The deputy's voice was careful, the voice of someone delivering unwelcome news. They had found the campsite. 2 tents, just as Gordon described. The smaller tent contained camping equipment, a sleeping bag, some personal effects. Nothing unusual. No wallets, no license plates, no photographs. Gordon insisted that Ned must have moved everything. He'd had hours. The deputy continued, as though Gordon hadn't spoken. Vehicle registration in the pickup's glove box identified the owner as Nathaniel Coyle, address in Vermont. Vermont State Police confirmed that Mr. Coyle had no criminal record. He was listed as a retired contractor. There was a pause. Gordon could hear the question forming before the deputy asked it. Any history of stress, mental health concerns, anything like that? Gordon hung up. He spent the next 3 hours on his laptop searching for the names he remembered. Paula Jean Kretschmer returned nothing useful. There were several Paula Kretschmers on social media, none of them matching the woman in the photograph. David Allen Peck was even more common, hundreds of results, impossible to narrow down without more information. The license plates were a dead end. He hadn't memorized the numbers. At some point, Gordon fell asleep on the couch. He dreamed of the reservoir, black and still under the stars, and of Ned Coyle standing at the water's edge, reciting names like a prayer. In the dream, Gordon was underwater, looking up at the surface, watching Ned's silhouette ripple and distort. He tried to swim toward the light, but his arms wouldn't move. He was sinking slowly toward the drowned town below. He woke gasping, his heart pounding, the afternoon light slanting through the blinds. 3 weeks passed. Gordon returned to work. He sat at his desk and stared at spreadsheets, searching for patterns that refused to emerge. His colleagues asked if he was feeling all right. He told them he was fine. He ate lunch alone, went home alone, lay awake in the dark, listening to the sounds of the building settling around him. Every creak, every footstep in the hallway above sent his heart racing. He tried to convince himself that the night in the Catskills had been an aberration, a moment of stress-induced hysteria. The deputy was right. He had been drinking. The light from the tent could have been anything. The objects he thought he saw could have been innocent. But he couldn't stop thinking about the way Ned had listened, the quality of attention, the questions designed to draw him out. And the final image, Ned standing in the red glow of taillights, writing down Gordon's license plate number with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. Everyone has a story. Everyone has something they're carrying. He began to research. Not the names. He had exhausted that avenue. But the man himself. Nathaniel Coyle, retired contractor, Vermont. The internet offered fragments, a LinkedIn profile, long dormant, listing skills in carpentry and project management. A mention in a local newspaper from 2008, something about a charity fishing tournament. A photo, grainy and poorly lit, that might have been Ned or might have been anyone. The man was a ghost, which proved nothing. Plenty of people lived offline, especially of a certain generation. It wasn't suspicious. It wasn't evidence of anything. And yet, Gordon found himself mapping the campgrounds and reservoirs within a day's drive of Vermont. Pepacton, Ashokan, Neversink, the Adirondacks, with their hundreds of lakes and trails. If someone wanted to meet strangers in isolated places, the opportunities were endless. He began to read news archives, searching for missing persons in the areas where someone like Ned might camp. There were dozens. Men and women who had gone hiking and never returned. Solo campers whose cars were found in trailhead parking lots, their tents still pitched, their belongings undisturbed. Most were eventually attributed to accidents, exposure, animal attacks. But some were never solved. Some simply vanished. Gordon made a file. He knew it was obsessive. Knew it was probably unhealthy, but he couldn't stop. The file grew thicker, filled with names and dates and photographs of people who had disappeared in the mountains. He began to notice patterns, or thought he did. Clusters of disappearances in certain areas during certain seasons. Solo travelers predominantly. People who, for one reason or another, wouldn't be immediately missed. People like him. It was October when the letter arrived. Gordon had moved by then, leaving the sublet in Yonkers for a small house in Connecticut, closer to his sister. He told himself it was for practical reasons. Better schools for her children, more space for family dinners. But he knew the truth. He wanted distance. He wanted to disappear in his own way, to make himself harder to find. The letter was handwritten, the envelope bearing no return address. The postmark was from upstate New York, a town he didn't recognize. Dear Gordon, I hope this finds you well. I've thought about you often since our evening together at Pepacton. You seemed like a man in pain, and I wanted to help you. I still want to help you. I understand why you were frightened. The things you saw, or thought you saw, would frighten anyone. But you didn't give me a chance to explain, and now I find myself wondering what stories you've been telling yourself. What fears you've allowed to grow in the dark. I want you to know that I forgive you. For the call to the police, for the accusations. You were acting on instinct. You were protecting yourself from something you didn't understand. Perhaps someday you'll let me explain. Perhaps someday we'll meet again, somewhere quiet, somewhere we can talk without fear. I would like that very much. In the meantime, take care of yourself, Gordon Fitch. Take care of that beautiful, broken heart. Your friend, Ned. Gordon read the letter 3 times. His hands were steady, and that surprised him. He had expected to feel terror, panic, the urge to run. But what he felt instead was something closer to resignation. The letter confirmed what he had known, on some level, since the moment he watched Ned write down his license plate number. This was not over. It would never be over. He took the letter to the police station in Milford, where a detective listened to his story and made copies, and promised to look into it. But Gordon could see the skepticism in the man's eyes, the same skepticism he'd seen in the deputy's face months ago. A letter from a camping acquaintance expressing hope they'd meet again. Unusual, perhaps. Creepy, certainly. But not illegal, not actionable. Your friend, Ned. Gordon thought about the wallets and the photographs, the names recited in the dark. He thought about the people in his file, the ones who had vanished without explanation. He thought about what it meant to be chosen, to be seen, to be understood, to be marked. He had gone to the Catskills to escape, to disappear in his own small way, and instead he had been found. The letter remained in the file alongside the photographs and the news clippings and the maps of remote places where a man might take someone who trusted him. Gordon knew he should throw it away, burn it, pretend it had never existed. But he kept it. He read it sometimes, late at night, trying to understand what Ned saw when he looked at Gordon Fitch, what made him worth collecting. That beautiful broken heart. Gordon had changed his locks. He had installed security cameras. He had purchased a gun legally and learned to use it at a range in Bridgeport, standing in a booth beside men who looked at him with vague suspicion, sensing perhaps that he was not one of them, that his reasons for being there were different from theirs. He had done everything a reasonable person would do to protect themselves from a threat that might not even exist. But still, sometimes, when he was driving through unfamiliar territory, he would see a man standing at the edge of a campground or walking along a reservoir shore, and his heart would seize in his chest. And always, always the man would turn and smile, and it would be a stranger. Just a stranger. But the smile would remain with Gordon for hours afterward, the quality of it. The sense that he was being observed by someone who knew him better than he knew himself. He never went camping again. He rarely left the house after dark. And every time a letter arrived with an unfamiliar postmark, he would stand at the mailbox for long minutes, his hand trembling, unable to open the envelope. In the end, this was what Ned had taken from him. Not his life, but his peace. His ability to trust the ordinary kindnesses of strangers, the casual friendliness of people met in passing. Gordon Fitch had gone to the mountains looking for a restoration, and he had found something else entirely. He had found the knowledge that there were people who moved through the world collecting souls. Not literally, perhaps, not in any way that could be proven or prosecuted, but collecting them nonetheless. Their stories, their secrets, their particular vulnerabilities, building a catalog of people who would not be missed. And Gordon understood in the months that followed that this was the true horror, not the possibility that Ned Coyle was a killer, though he might be. There was no way to know, but the certainty that Gordon would spend the rest of his life wondering, looking over his shoulder, starting at shadows, waiting for the knock on the door, the figure at the window, the next letter in that careful handwriting. Perhaps someday we'll meet again, somewhere quiet. Gordon had memorized those words. He suspected he would never forget them. Some friendships, after all, last forever, whether you want them to or not. Story 5. David Miller had been smelling dirt for 6 months. Not the pleasant scent of garden soil or rain-dampened earth, but something mineral and ancient, like the inside of a grave. It clung to his hands no matter how often he washed them. He could taste it at the back of his throat when he swallowed. His wife had stopped mentioning it after the third time she'd leaned close and found nothing, her face creasing with concern, that had less to do with phantom smells and more to do with what they might signify about her husband's mental state. The smell was strongest near the basement door of his parents' house on Chesapeake Avenue, where he stood now on Thanksgiving afternoon, his hand resting on the cold brass knob he'd been avoiding for a decade. The house looked the same as it always did. 3 stories of cream-colored clapboard, black shutters, burgundy door, his mother's dying chrysanthemums in their planters. Everything preserved exactly as it had been. His mother believed in preservation. She'd been preserving Simon's memory for 10 years, setting his place at the table for every holiday meal, maintaining his bedroom like a museum, polishing the brass knocker every Wednesday because Simon had always loved how it caught the light. David opened the door. The smell of roasting turkey should have been comforting. Instead, it made him think of other things cooking, changing state, decomposing in heat and darkness. His mother emerged from the kitchen, still beautiful in her practiced way, but there was something hungry in her eyes. There had always been something hungry there. "David, darling." She kissed his cheek, her lips dry. "Right on time. Is Fiona parking?" "She's in Boston. Her mother's hip surgery." The lie came easily. Fiona was actually at their house in Severna Park, grateful for the excuse David had fabricated. His wife had never enjoyed these gatherings, had always sensed something wrong in this house, something she couldn't articulate, but that made her uneasy. "Oh, how disappointing. Well, it's just us then. Your father's in his study." Gerard Miller had retreated to his study years ago and rarely emerged except for meals. He had been a chemical engineer, precise and methodical, but retirement had softened him, made him vague. David found him in his leather chair, a book open, but unread in his lap. The room smelled of old paper and furniture polish. His father's handshake was weak. When had that happened? They ate at 6, the three of them arranged around the dining table with its lace cloth and bone china. The fourth place sat between David and his mother, a silent presence. David had positioned himself so he wouldn't have to look at it directly, but his peripheral vision caught the glint of unused silverware, the empty wine glass. His mother served the meal with ritual precision: turkey, stuffing, sweet potatoes with marshmallows, green beans, almondine, cranberry sauce from a can shaped like a can, because that's what Simon had always liked. Every year the same. Every year a performance of normalcy around a void. Gerard ate quietly, mechanically. A man enduring rather than enjoying. David picked at his food. The turkey was dry. It was always dry. His mother had never been a natural cook, but she believed in tradition, in following recipes exactly, in doing what was expected. Leonora made conversation about neighbors, about the Howell family, and their prolific reproduction, about maintaining family connections. The suggestions came wrapped in careful phrasing, but David heard the accusations underneath. Some families understood loyalty. Some families held together. If Simon had felt more welcomed, more understood, he wouldn't have left. The unspoken blame hung in the air like the smell of overcooked turkey. The doorbell rang. The sound cut through the dining room like a blade. Leonora's fork clattered against her plate. Gerard looked up, startled from his fog. No one visited on Thanksgiving. No one interrupted the ritual. Leonora moved with surprising speed. Her napkin dropped carelessly on her chair. David followed, his father trailing behind, the three of them crowding into the hallway like actors awaiting their cue. Leonora opened the door. A man stood on the porch. He was perhaps 32, 33, lean and weathered, the dark hair graying prematurely at the temples. He wore jeans and a canvas jacket, work boots that had seen genuine work. His face was angular, familiar in a way that made David's stomach clench. But something was wrong. The resemblance was there, the bone structure, the general configuration of features. But it sat on his face like a mask that didn't quite fit. The proportions were subtly off, as if someone had described Simon from memory and a sculptor had worked from the description rather than a photograph. Or as if Simon's face had been broken and healed incorrectly, the bones reset at slightly wrong angles. The eyes were worst. They were the right color, hazel like Simon's had been. But they looked at David with a flatness that made his skin crawl. Not empty, exactly. Full of something that shouldn't be there. The man's voice carried that familiar rasp, that careful enunciation Simon had always used. An apology for the lack of warning. An admission that calling ahead would have required courage he hadn't possessed. A question about whether there was still room at the table. Leonora pulled him inside with a strength that surprised David, her carefully maintained composure shattering into tears. Gerard stood motionless, his face slack with shock. David remained by the stairs, his hand gripping the newel post. The man looked at David over their mother's shoulder. Those wrong eyes holding something David couldn't name but recognized anyway. A greeting. Simple. Direct. "Hello, David." David said nothing. His mouth had gone dry. His heart hammered against his ribs in a rhythm that felt like exposure, like guilt made audible. Leonora finally released the man, holding him at arm's length, her hands gripping his shoulders as if afraid he might evaporate. She was cataloging him, David realized, checking for markers of authenticity. The small scar above his left eyebrow. Yes, there. From when he'd fallen from the oak tree. The crooked left incisor where a baseball had caught him in the mouth. The way his right earlobe was slightly longer than his left, a genetic quirk. She noted how thin he was, questioned where he'd been, why he hadn't written or called. Her voice trembled with hurt and hope tangled together, and the suggestion that they sit down, that there was much to explain. They moved to the living room, that formal space reserved for guests, with its uncomfortable Victorian sofa and matching chairs. Leonora sat beside the man, holding his hand as if he might flee. Gerard lowered himself into his usual chair, still silent, still processing. David remained standing near the doorway, calculating angles of escape. The man surveyed the room with what appeared to be genuine recognition, nostalgia. The grandfather clock, the Hummel figurines on the mantel, the watercolor of the Chesapeake Bay, painted by Leonora's mother, above the fireplace. His gaze lingered on each item with familiarity that could have been authentic or meticulously researched. A quiet observation about how everything remained unchanged, how the preservation had made him feel expected, waited for. Gerard's careful questions came like a scientist requesting data. Where had he been? What had he done? The man took a breath, his fingers absently rubbing the fabric of the sofa, an old nervous gesture Simon had had. David remembered it from their childhood, from late-night talks in the bedroom they'd shared until David left for college. How thoroughly had this imposter researched them? He spoke of California, fishing boats out of San Diego, time in Alaska on a cannery line, moving around, trying to discover who he was away from expectations and family weight. The story was plausible, vague enough to be uncheckable, specific enough to sound authentic. California, Alaska. Far enough away to explain the lack of contact, romantic enough to excuse the abandonment. Leonora's hurt question came wrapped in understanding, as if she'd always known her son was too free-spirited for conventional communication. 10 years without a single call. The man's response carried practiced shame. He'd left angry, said terrible things. The longer he stayed away, the harder it became to reach out. He'd convinced himself they were better off without him. A redemption. Narrative, complete and emotionally satisfying, but practically impossible to verify. Leonora spoke of the place settings, the holidays, the unwavering certainty that he would return. Her vindication was quiet but absolute. The man looked at David then, really looked at him, and David saw something in his eyes that made his blood run cold. Recognition, yes, but something else. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Welcome home," David managed. The words tasted like ash. They returned to the dining room. Leonora heated Simon's portion, brought him fresh everything, arranged his plate with the care of someone presenting an offering. The man ate slowly, savoring each bite, offering comments about missing home cooking, about how nothing tasted like this anywhere else in the world. Gerard asked careful questions about his life, his work, his plans. The man answered with practiced ease, filling in a decade with broad strokes, details that could mean everything or nothing. Boats, warehouses, construction crews. He learned to weld, to repair engines, to speak passable Spanish. He'd been in debt, then solvent, then broke again. He'd been lonely, mostly. He'd thought about coming home 1,000 times. David watched him navigate the conversation with expertise. The man knew the right things. Gerard's retirement from DuPont Chemical. Leonora's garden club prize for her roses 3 years running. The sale of the house next door to a family from New York. He asked after old neighbors, old friends. He remembered Christopher Howell, wondered if they were still in touch. Leonora's answer carried both pride and sadness. Christopher had become a pediatrician in Baltimore, married with 2 children. The boys had been so close once. The man expressed a desire to reconnect, and the presumption of it was either breathtakingly confident or utterly genuine. David couldn't determine which. After dinner, Leonora suggested he stay the night. His old room was exactly as he'd left it, preserved like a museum, like a shrine. The man accepted with gratitude that seemed genuine, and David watched his mother lead him upstairs with the tender care of someone handling something precious and fragile. Gerard excused himself to his study. David found himself alone in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher with mechanical precision, trying to organize his thoughts. Simon was dead. David knew this with absolute certainty because he had killed him. It had happened on a November night, much like this one 10 years ago. Simon had come home drunk, loud and belligerent, high on whatever pills he'd managed to acquire. He'd been deteriorating for months. The addiction had progressed from recreational to compulsive, his personality fragmenting into paranoia and rage. He'd started accusing David of things, stealing from him, plotting against him, poisoning their parents against him. That night, the accusations had escalated. Simon had become convinced that David was trying to have him committed, to take his share of the eventual inheritance. He'd attacked David in their father's study, grabbed a letter opener from the desk. They'd fought clumsily, desperately. David had been stronger, more sober. He'd wrenched the letter opener away, and then his hands had been around Simon's throat. He remembered the feeling with perfect clarity, the tendons under his fingers, the cartilage of the windpipe, the frantic pulse weakening and stopping. He'd held on longer than necessary, making sure. When he'd finally released his grip, Simon's eyes had been open, fixed, empty. The panic had been immediate and absolute. But beneath it, something else. Relief, the problem of Simon, the embarrassment, the chaos, the drain on family resources and family reputation was solved permanently. David had dragged Simon's body to the basement. Lighter than expected, Simon had always been thin, but addiction had whittled him to nothing, and buried him in the far corner, in the dirt, beneath the old shelving unit. He'd worked through the night, methodically, carefully. In the morning, he'd taken Simon's car to BWI Airport and left it in long-term parking with the keys in the ignition, creating a narrative. Simon had left, as he'd threatened to do so many times. No one would question it. And no one had. The police had filed a missing person report, but hadn't investigated vigorously. Simon was an adult with a history of erratic behavior and threats to leave. He'd gone voluntarily. Case closed. 2 years later, Gerard had decided to renovate the basement, poured concrete over the dirt floor. David had made sure to be unavailable to help, invented a work trip. The concrete had sealed everything, made it permanent. Though David had gone down there the morning after. He'd forced himself to, had stood at the top of the stairs for 10 minutes, gathering courage, then descended with his heart hammering. The basement had looked exactly as he'd left it. Boxes stacked against the walls, tools on the shelves, dirt floor undisturbed. No trace of what he'd done. No evidence. The relief had been overwhelming, almost euphoric. He'd walked that floor, studied it from every angle, convinced himself that the earth showed no signs of disturbance because he'd been thorough, careful, successful. He'd never once considered the alternative. David's hand shook as he placed a plate in the dishwasher. 10 years of careful construction, of building a life on top of that basement floor, of maintaining the fiction of the troubled runaway. And now this man had arrived, threatening everything. He lifted his hands to inspect them in the kitchen light, clean. The skin was clean, the nails trimmed, no visible dirt. Yet he could smell it. The mineral scent, wet earth. The smell of the basement, but concentrated, as if his hands had just been digging. He brought them to his face. Stronger now. He could taste the ice at the back of his throat. He turned on the tap, scrubbed his hands with dish soap, hot water scalding his skin. The smell persisted. He used more soap, scrubbed harder until his hands were red and raw. Still there. Always there. It had started months ago, just a faint whiff near the basement door, then throughout the house, then following him to work, to his car, to his own bedroom. Fiona had asked about it once. Wondered if something had died in the walls, if there was a leak, a problem with the foundation. But when she leaned close to smell what he was talking about, she'd found nothing. The smell existed only for David, or it had until now. Until this man who claimed to be Simon had walked through the door carrying that same scent with him. Earth and burial and 10 years of waiting. The question was simple. Who was he? A con artist who'd researched the family, learned enough details to impersonate the missing son? It happened. David had handled estate cases where grifters had inserted themselves into families, claimed inheritance, exploited grief and desperation. His mother was vulnerable, had always been vulnerable where Simon was concerned. She'd wanted to believe. Or the alternative was impossible. Simon was dead. David had buried him, had felt the absolute stillness of his body, the absence of breath, the emptiness that meant death. But 10 years ago, David had been 28, in shock, terrified. Had he checked thoroughly? Had he really confirmed death, or had he simply assumed it? Medical examiners determined death. Doctors confirmed it. Not panicked lawyers in dark basements. David's stomach churned. He gripped the counter, steadying himself. No, Simon was dead. This was an imposter, a very good imposter, and David would prove it. He went upstairs. His old room, the one he'd occupied until college, had been converted to a guest room, neutral and impersonal. Fiona hated staying here. She said the house felt wrong, said she never slept well in it. David had always dismissed her intuition, but now he wondered what she sensed. What emanations came from below, from what was buried and denied? He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around him. Somewhere above, in Simon's preserved room, the imposter slept. Or didn't sleep. David imagined him awake, planning his next move, calculating how to extract maximum value from this deception. In the morning, David would begin his investigation. He would find the flaw, the inconsistency, the detail that revealed the fraud. He would protect his parents from exploitation, protect himself from exposure, protect the careful life he'd built. He had to. The alternative was unthinkable. David woke early, his sleep having been thin and fractured, populated by dreams of open graves and familiar faces with wrong eyes. The house was quiet. Through his window, dawn painted the yard in shades of gray and amber. The oak tree stood bare, its branches reaching like supplication. He dressed and went downstairs. His mother was already in the kitchen, still in her robe, making coffee. She looked younger somehow, the lines around her mouth softened, her movements lighter. Hope had rejuvenated her. Her question about his sleep came with an offer of coffee. David accepted both with minimal response. He suggested spending time with the man and getting reacquainted. The way his mother's face lit up at the word brother made his stomach turn. The man appeared an hour later, showered and dressed in clean clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt that had probably belonged to Simon, preserved in his closet all these years. He accepted coffee, sat at the kitchen table, utterly at ease. David studied him in the morning light. The resemblance was undeniable, but also explicable. Simon had been handsome in a conventional way. Good bone structure, regular features, nothing truly distinctive. With the right build, the right age range, someone could approximate his appearance. The details, the scars, the crooked tooth, could be coincidental or deliberately recreated. David's suggestion of a walk, like they used to take, was met with eyes that flickered with something. Caution, calculation, before agreement came. They left the house together, following the familiar route through the neighborhood towards the water. November had turned the trees skeletal. Leaves crunched underfoot, and the air smelled of wood smoke and decay. Simon, or the man claiming to be him, walked with his hands in his pockets, his gait slightly uneven, favoring his left leg. David asked about the injury. Alaska, the man explained. A fall on a boat deck, torn ligaments that never healed properly. Convenient. An explanation for any gait differences from how Simon had walked. David filed it away. They reached Quiet Waters Park, the path winding along the South River. This had been their place as children before things fractured. Crabs caught here, sailing their father's small boat, summer afternoons diving off the dock. The man recalled a specific memory. David falling in, needing rescue, 8 years old and terrified. The detail was accurate. David tested it with exaggeration, calling it life-saving. The man's dismissal matched Simon's character perfectly. You would have been fine. You always exaggerated. Simon had never liked being cast as the hero. They walked in silence for a while. David organized his questions, his strategy. Too aggressive, and the man would shut down. Too passive, and he'd control the narrative. David finally asked the essential question. Why now? Why come back after 10 years? The man stopped walking, stared out at the water. The river was gray, choppy, reflecting the overcast sky. I'm dying. The words hung between them. David felt something shift in his chest, a sensation like a trapdoor opening. The explanation came flat and matter-of-fact. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, 6 to 8 months remaining. 10 years of running from family, from himself, and now time was running out. He wanted to come home, wanted to make peace with what he'd left behind. It was perfect. If this was a con, it was brilliant. The dying man seeking redemption. Who could question that? Who would demand proof, push too hard, risk the cruelty of doubting someone facing death? They walked back to the house. Leonora had made lunch. Sandwiches cut into triangles, the way she'd done when they were children. She served them with chips and pickles, chattering about her plans for Christmas, about how wonderful it would be to have everyone together again. Gerard emerged from his study, still vague, still processing, but more present than David had seen him in years. That afternoon, the man told stories. He sat in the living room, Leonora beside him, Gerard in his chair, David perched on the piano bench, and he recounted their childhood. The treehouse in the oak. getting lost in the woods and Simon navigating them home by following the creek. Holidays, birthdays, ordinary days made precious by nostalgia. Leonora laughed and cried, correcting small details, adding her own memories. The man accepted her corrections gracefully, admitting his memory wasn't perfect. Time had blurred things. It was masterful, David thought. Admit to uncertainty. Let the audience fill in gaps. Make them complicit in building the narrative. Gerard asked about practical matters. Where was he living? What were his finances like? Did he need help? The man demurred, said he was managing, didn't want to be a burden. This, too, was pitch perfect. Ask for too much too soon, and you revealed yourself as a grifter. Show reluctance, force the family to offer, and you appeared genuine. In the evening, after Gerard had retreated and Leonora had gone to the kitchen to prepare dinner, David found himself alone with the man. They sat in the living room, the space between them charged with unspoken things. The man spoke quietly. He knew David didn't believe him. David considered lying, maintaining pretense, but something in the man's eyes suggested that pretense was pointless. He mentioned DNA testing, a simple solution. The man smiled, and for a moment David saw something genuine in his expression, something that looked like respect. He used third person when speaking of Simon, as if acknowledging the distance between who he'd been and who he'd become, or perhaps establishing himself as separate entirely. David pressed. If this was a con, it was cruel. Their mother had been waiting 10 years to exploit that vulnerability. The man's voice hardened. And if he truly was Simon? If he'd survived whatever David thought had happened and come back, what then? Had he been gone too long, become too inconvenient? There was an edge now, something sharp beneath the surface. David felt his pulse quicken. He claimed only to want to protect his family. The question came like a blade, from the imposter or from the truth. Outside, darkness was falling. Leonora called from the kitchen. The man stood, moved toward the doorway, paused. His parting words hung in the air like a threat or a prophecy. What if he truly was Simon? What if he'd survived? What would that mean for David? He left the room. David sat alone, the grandfather clock ticking its eternal rhythm, measuring out seconds that felt like accusations. What if? What if Simon hadn't died that night? What if David's panicked check for vital signs had been inadequate, his assumption of death premature? What if Simon had been unconscious, injured but alive, and had woken in that shallow grave to find himself buried? The horror of it crashed over David. The sensation of suffocation, of clawing through dirt, of emerging into air after being entombed. The terror, the rage, the knowledge of betrayal. If Simon had survived that, if he'd crawled out and fled, what had those 10 years been like? What had he thought about as he worked on fishing boats and construction sites? A healing in body, but perhaps not in mind. And if he'd come back now with terminal cancer, with nothing to lose, what would he want? Justice? Revenge? Simply to see his family again before the end? Or to lead David into a trap? David's hands were shaking. He pressed them against his thighs, trying to steady himself. He was being paranoid. Simon was dead. This was an imposter, nothing more. A DNA test would prove it, and the charade would end. But what if it didn't? What if the DNA came back as a match? David stood and walked to the basement door. His hand rested on the knob. He hadn't been down there in years, had avoided it deliberately. His father stored things there, but David had always found excuses not to help, not to descend those stairs into the place where his life had fractured. He opened the door. The stairs creaked as he descended. The basement smelled of mildew and old concrete. His father had installed better lighting some years back, fluorescent tubes that buzzed and flickered. The space was cluttered with the accumulation of decades, Boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture, Gerard's engineering textbooks, paint cans, tools. David moved to the far corner to the shelving unit that held paint supplies. His heart hammered. The earth beneath looked undisturbed, concrete floor extending unbroken. But he knew what lay beneath. He'd buried Simon deep enough, covered him thoroughly enough, and then his father had poured a concrete slab over that section years ago, during a basement renovation David had conveniently missed. The concrete was smooth, unremarkable. No one would know what lay beneath, unless someone dug. David's phone buzzed. A text from Fiona. "How's it going? You okay?" He realized he'd been down here for 20 minutes, staring at the floor like a man transfixed by his own guilt. He typed back, "Fine. Long day. Home tomorrow." He climbed the stairs, emerging into the lit warmth of the house. Leonora called everyone to dinner. They assembled at the table. 4 places now, all occupied. The man sat in Simon's spot, eating his mother's pot roast, discussing plans for the weekend. He was staying through Sunday, he said. He hoped David would be there. David said he would. He'd taken Monday off as well, actually. Extended weekend. Plenty of time. Plenty of time to figure this out. That night, David lay awake, his mind cycling through scenarios. DNA tests, expedite results 3 or 4 days at most. He could wait that long, but something gnawed at him. The man's confidence, his ease, his willingness to undergo testing. Grifters usually avoided verification. He rose at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep. He crept downstairs, moving quietly through the dark house. A light showed under the study door. He pushed it open. The man sat at Gerard's desk, going through papers. He looked up, unsurprised by David's arrival. The will lay open before him. Leonora had shown it to him earlier, the man explained. She'd wanted him to understand that he'd been kept in it all these years. Equal shares, David and Simon. Very generous, considering the abandonment. David's accusation came swift. This was about money, about exploitation, about... The man's interruption was sharp and cold. No, this was about watching David sweat, about seeing how long he could maintain his facade before cracking. The silence stretched. The man stood and moved around the desk. Taller, leaner, something predatory in his posture now. The easy charm had been stripped away entirely. His question was quiet but devastating. Did David really think he didn't know? Didn't remember? David's denial was automatic, but his mouth had gone dry. The specifics came like blows. The letter opener, the fight in this room, being dragged down basement stairs, the taste of dirt, waking up 6 hours later, buried alive. David staggered back, his hand finding the doorframe. The man, Simon, it was Simon, spoke of 10 years spent trying to understand why. Money? Jealousy? Had David been threatened by something? Or had Simon simply become too inconvenient, too embarrassing, too much of a stain on the respectable Miller family? David tried to say his name, but the word was cut off like a whip crack. He didn't get to say that name. Not after what he'd done. If this was Simon, if he'd survived, what was his endgame? Exposure? Charges? Murder? The cancer was real, Simon confirmed. Before he died, he wanted David's confession. Wanted him to admit what he'd done, where he'd put him, what he'd tried to cover up. David managed weak words about accidents, about fights, about panic. Simon moved closer. You buried me alive, David. You patted down the dirt and walked away, and you've been building your life on top of that grave ever since. David claimed he'd thought Simon was dead, had checked for a pulse. Did you? Did you really check? Or did you just want me to be dead so badly that you made it true? The question hung between them. David had no answer. Because the truth was somewhere in the middle, wasn't it? He'd wanted Simon dead, not actively, not consciously, but in that deep place where shameful wishes lived. Simon had been chaos, embarrassment, evidence of the family's failure, and in that moment of violence, David had seen an opportunity to eliminate the problem. "What do you want?" David whispered. Simon wanted the basement, wanted David to show him the burial site, wanted him to break through the concrete his father had so conveniently poured. David protested. There was nothing there, and the concrete had sealed it. They'd need equipment. Simon's smile was terrible. "Then you have nothing to worry about." They stood in the study, two brothers bound by blood and violence, locked in a game neither could afford to lose. Finally, David agreed. Tomorrow, when their parents were out. Simon left the room. David sank into his father's chair, his hands trembling. What had he agreed to? What was waiting under that concrete? He knew the answer. Nothing was waiting. Simon was dead, buried in that corner, probably decomposed to bones after 10 years. The concrete was the final proof of David's crime, yes, but also its protection. Without heavy equipment, without time, without making enormous noise and mess, they couldn't get through it. So why was Simon so confident? Unless there was something else down there. David's mind raced back through the years. Had there been another incident he'd forgotten? Another violence he'd suppressed? His memory of that night with Simon was clear, crystal sharp despite a decade of trying to blur it. But memories could lie. Trauma could erase and rewrite. He went to his room, pulled out his laptop, began searching. Missing persons reports from Maryland, from Annapolis specifically, from around that time. Nothing matched. He tried broader searches, unsolved cases, unidentified remains. Nothing. He was being paranoid. Simon was playing mind games, trying to unsettle him, force a confession. That's what this was, a dying man's revenge, executed through psychological torture. But the doubt had taken root now, spreading through David's carefully constructed certainty like rot. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold. Leonora left at 9 for her garden club, kissing both sons. She'd been calling Simon that without hesitation, her son, her baby, returned her. Before driving off in her sedan, Gerard departed at 9:30 for his constitutional walk, a 3-mile loop that took exactly an hour. David and Simon stood in the basement, surrounded by boxes and dust, staring at the concrete floor. That smell, wet earth, mineral and dark, was overwhelming down here. David's hands reeked of it. He could taste it in his mouth. David needed to know what Simon thought he'd find. Simon had brought a sledgehammer from the garage. He weighed it in his hands, testing its balance, then set it down against the wall. He wasn't looking for anything, he said. He knew what was down there. Nothing, because he was standing right here. David's throat tightened. Then why this? Why now? Simon moved to the far corner, to the section of concrete that covered the old burial site. He knelt, placed his palm flat against it. This was where David had put him. Right here. 6, maybe 7 feet of dirt. David hadn't been careful about depth. He'd been in a hurry, panicked. David told him to stop. But Simon continued. His voice quiet, but filled with something underneath that made David's skin crawl. He described waking up in darkness. True darkness. Complete and absolute. The kind that existed only in burial. David wanted to leave, to run up the stairs, but his legs wouldn't move. The second thing was the weight. The pressure on my chest. I couldn't expand my lungs properly. Each breath took enormous effort, and the air... Simon paused, his hands still pressed to the concrete. The air tasted wrong, stale, used up, thin. I knew I was suffocating. Slowly. "Simon, please." The third thing was the dirt in my mouth, my nose, my eyes. He'd been sloppy about covering my face. Some of it got inside when I tried to breathe. I can still taste it. 10 years later, I wake up some nights with that taste on my tongue. Mineral and rot. The flavor of being buried alive. David's stomach churned. His hands were shaking. The smell of earth was suffocating. I don't know how long I was down here. Hours. Long enough that I'd accepted I was going to die. That my brother had murdered me and I'd suffocate in this darkness, in this hole, and no one would ever know. Mom and Dad would think I'd run away. You'd go on with your life, your respectable, successful life. I thought you were dead. I checked for a pulse. You checked for 10 seconds, maybe 15. You wanted me to be dead so badly that you convinced yourself I was. Simon looked up at David, and his eyes were flat, empty, filled with that wrongness David had seen from the beginning. But I wasn't dead, just unconscious, concussed. And when I woke up, I had to decide, die here or try to survive. How did you get out? Simon smiled, and it was terrible. Very slowly, very carefully. I could only move my fingers at first. Just my fingers. I worked them into the dirt above my face, creating tiny spaces as compression points. I packed the dirt down around the spaces to keep them from collapsing. Inch by inch, I made a channel to the surface. It took hours, maybe 6 hours, maybe 8. I lost all sense of time. David felt dizzy. The basement was tilting. My fingernails tore off, both hands. I didn't feel it at the time. Adrenaline, I suppose. But later, when I was out, the pain was extraordinary. They grew back wrong. See? Simon held up his hands. His fingernails were thick, ridged, slightly twisted. Evidence of trauma that David had noticed but dismissed as an old injury, a coincidence. When I finally broke through to air, I lay there for another hour, maybe more. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I just breathed, and I listened to the house above me. Listened to you moving around up there. You were in the kitchen, washing dishes. I could hear the water running, the clink of plates, normal sounds. You were having a normal evening after burying your brother alive. Simon paused, and his smile was terrible. And then, do you know what I did? I didn't run. I should have run, but I didn't. I was so angry, David. So full of rage that I could barely see. But I was also thinking clearly for the first time in years. The drugs had burned off in that hole. Fear does that. Clarifies everything. He gestured to the concrete floor beneath them. I grabbed the shovel you'd left leaning against the wall, and I filled the hole back in. Every shovelful. I packed the dirt down. I smoothed it. I scattered the surface dust. I moved the boxes back exactly where they'd been. I wanted you to come down here the next day and see nothing. I wanted the floor to look undisturbed. David's chest tightened. Why? Because I wanted you to doubt yourself, to wonder if you'd really done it. To lie awake at night asking, did I bury him? Is he down there? Did I check carefully enough for a pulse? Or did I imagine the whole thing? Simon's eyes glittered. I wanted you to go insane slowly, methodically, over years. And judging by that smell you keep noticing, the one you scrub your hands raw trying to remove, it worked. David's apology came as a whisper. God, Simon, he was so sorry. Simon's response was cold. No, not yet. But he would be. The words hung in the air. David looked at his brother alive, standing here after clawing out of his own grave, and saw something in his eyes that made his blood run cold. David managed to ask, what did Simon want? Simon wanted David to understand something. He stood, brushed concrete dust from his jeans, and laid out the truth with methodical precision. He'd spent 10 years thinking about this. about David, about what he'd done and what it meant. California, the boats, trying to start over. None of it had worked. The suffocation, the darkness, the weight had followed him everywhere. David offered confession. The police. He'd tell them everything. Simon's refusal was immediate. No, he wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in something more meaningful. What? I'm moving in. The words didn't make sense. David stared, trying to process. Simon's explanation came with terrible clarity. He was going to live here, in this house, in his preserved room. Sunday dinners, Christmas, Thanksgiving, every birthday, every holiday. The prodigal son, finally home. And David would do what, exactly? Accept it. Welcome it. Celebrate it. Simon moved closer, and David could smell the earth on him, that mineral wrongness that had been haunting him for months. David would be the perfect brother. Supportive, loving, glad to have him back. He'd help Simon reconcile with their parents, include him in his life, his career, his future. David's question was automatic. Why would he do that? Because refusal meant the truth came out. All of it. Simon would describe waking up in a grave, the taste, the darkness, the hours of clawing through dirt with bare hands. He'd show their parents his fingernails. He'd make them understand exactly what their respectable, successful son was capable of. David's realization was immediate. Arrest, obviously. Attempted murder at minimum. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what it would do to their parents. Finding out one son tried to kill the other, that they'd been living above a grave for 10 years, that everything they believed about their family was a lie. Simon confirmed it. David had already destroyed them. This was just offering him a chance to prevent them from finding out. Simon's plan unfolded with quiet precision. He'd stay. He'd be the son Leonora had always wanted. Reformed, grateful, appreciative of family. David would help him. Share his inheritance, his connections, his life. And every single day, David would remember what he'd done, what Simon had survived, what could be revealed at any moment. David's accusation was hoarse. That wasn't justice. That was torture. Yes. Simon's smile was radiant, genuine. But here's the beautiful part. You're going to do it. You're going to smile and welcome me and pretend to be happy about it. Because the alternative, the truth, would destroy Mom and Dad more completely than I ever could. And despite everything, you love them. You don't want to hurt them. He was right. David understood it with sickening clarity. Simon had constructed the perfect trap. Not legal punishment, which would be finite, comprehensible. Not even physical revenge. But this, a lifetime sentence of pretending, of playing the loving brother while living with the knowledge of what he'd done, of what Simon had endured, of how easily the truth could come out. How long, David managed to ask. How long did Simon expect this to go on? Simon touched his chest. Until he died. The cancer was real. 6 months, maybe 8. Not very long in the grand scheme of things. But he intended to make them count. He'd live in this house, eat at that table, sleep in his old bed. Watch David squirm every single day. And then when he was gone, David would spend the rest of his life wondering if Simon had left a letter somewhere. A recording. Some piece of evidence that would surface after his death. David's voice broke. Simon was insane. No. I'm the person you made me when you put me in the ground. Simon walked toward the stairs, then paused. One more thing David should know. He'd told Leonora he wanted to be buried in the family plot, the cemetery on Route 2. When the time came, David would carry his coffin. He'd lower him into the earth with his own hands. And he'd think about how Simon had done the same thing for himself in this basement. on the night David tried to make him disappear. He climbed the stairs, leaving David alone with the smell of earth and the concrete floor that covered nothing but dirt and memory. Above, the front door opened, Gerard returning from his walk. David heard his mother's voice, too, back early from garden club, asking Simon if he'd like tea. The sound of normal life, continuing in the house above a grave that had been empty all along. David sank to the floor, his back against the concrete wall. His hands still smelled of earth. They would always smell of earth now. He understood that. For 6 months, maybe 8, he would play his role. The loving brother, the supportive son. And Simon would watch him, would savor every moment of David's discomfort, every forced smile, every hollow word of welcome. And after Simon died, after the funeral where David would lower his brother's coffin into the ground with trembling hands, he would spend the rest of his life waiting for the letter to arrive, for the recording to surface, for the evidence that Simon had surely left behind to destroy him at the moment of his deepest relief, unless David acted first, unless he found a way to... But no, that's what Simon was counting on. Another act of violence, another attempt to eliminate the problem. And this time, there would be no doubt, no uncertainty. Simon was alive, visible, witnessed. Killing him now would be unambiguous murder. The trap was perfect, inescapable. And David had built it himself 10 years ago when he'd put his hands around his brother's throat and held on until the struggling stopped. Or hadn't stopped. Not quite. Not enough. He pulled himself to his feet, climbed the stairs on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. In the kitchen, Simon sat at the table with their parents, eating the lemon cookies Leonora had made. He looked up as David entered, smiled warmly. Mom was planning her Christmas party, he said. David would come, wouldn't he? Gerard and Leonora looked at David expectantly, hopefully. Their family, reunited, their dreams fulfilled. They couldn't see what David saw in Simon's eyes. That flat wrongness, that hunger that matched their mother's, but was so much darker, so much more knowing. David heard himself agree. Of course he'd be there. Simon's smile widened. He raised his teacup in a small toast, just for David. A gesture that said, perfect. Keep going. 6 more months of this. David raised his own cup in response because what else could he do? The place at the table would be filled now every holiday, every Sunday dinner. Simon would sit there, eating their mother's cooking, telling stories about his travels, being the son she'd always prayed would return. And David would sit across from him, smelling earth on his hands that no amount of washing could remove, tasting dirt in his mouth whenever he tried to eat, feeling the weight of concrete and soil and suffocation pressing on his chest with every breath. Buried alive, just like Simon had been. Only Simon had clawed his way out. David never would. Story 6. The first sound came 6 hours into the drive, somewhere in the empty dark between Albuquerque and Amarillo. Leo Padilla had almost convinced himself there was nothing in the back of the van. He had constructed an elaborate architecture of denial, a mansion with many rooms, and he had wandered through it for 300 miles while the white lines disappeared beneath the hood and the desert scrolled past like a fever dream. Drugs, he had told himself. Documents. Medical supplies that couldn't go through normal channels. The cargo area was climate-controlled, wasn't it? That hum he couldn't quite hear might be a refrigeration unit. Organs for transplant. Something valuable. Something illegal. Something that was none of his business. Then the thumping started, and the mansion collapsed. 3 impacts against the metal wall that separated the cab from the cargo area. A pause. 3 more. 3 more. Leo's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The rhythm was too regular to be mechanical, too deliberate to be accidental. It was, he realized with a sick lurch in his stomach, a signal. A pattern he had learned in Boy Scouts 15 years ago, sitting around a campfire in the Superstition Mountains while a scoutmaster taught them survival skills they would never need. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. The van was doing 75 on an empty stretch of I-40, the speedometer needle steady, the engine humming its monotonous song. Leo's foot eased toward the brake. His eyes found the rearview mirror, then the side mirror, then the empty highway behind him. No other cars, no witnesses. Just the desert and the darkness and the sound of someone begging to be saved. He could stop. He could pull over right now, walk to the back of the van, use the key that was burning a hole in his pocket. He could find out what he was carrying and make a choice based on something other than fear and denial and the cold mathematics of desperation. His foot moved back to the accelerator. The thumping continued for another hour, growing weaker as the miles accumulated, until finally it stopped altogether. Leo told himself this was a good thing. Whatever was back there had given up, had accepted its situation, had settled into the quiet resignation of the transported. He told himself a lot of things in those hours, and none of them helped. What Leo didn't know, what he couldn't know, not yet, was that the thumping would be the easy part. The thumping he could ignore, could rationalize, could bury beneath the white noise of the road. The screaming would be harder. And the voice, the calm, reasonable, desperate voice that would reach through the wall somewhere in Illinois and tell him a story designed to break his heart. That would be the thing that killed him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. 12 hours earlier, the parking lot of the Desert Rose Motor Lodge had smelled of creosote and transmission fluid. Leo sat in his Civic with the windows down, watching the motel room door across the lot. Number 14. And thought about all the choices that had led him to this moment. The exposed wiring of his life, stripped bare. $2,300 to Sally Mae. $1,500 for his mother's dialysis copay. $800 for the apartment in Tempe where 2 roommates had already covered his portion twice and were running out of patience. His phone showed 11:47 p.m. The man on the encrypted app had said midnight. Leo had found the job posting 3 levels deep in a forum he should never have been browsing, a place where people with no options met people with no scruples. The listing had been simple. Driver needed. Phoenix to Baltimore. 1 trip. $12,000, no questions. He had read it 6 times before saving the link. He had opened it again the next morning and the morning after that, each time telling himself he was only curious. On the 4th day, his mother had called to say the insurance company was contesting her coverage again. And Leo had heard something in her voice he had never heard before. Not fear, exactly, but the absence of hope. The flat affect of someone who had stopped believing things would get better. That night, he had typed out a response to the listing. He had stared at the blinking cursor for 11 minutes before pressing send. That had been a week ago. Now he was here, in a parking lot in the Arizona desert, waiting for a stranger to emerge from a motel room and hand him the keys to something he understood in the abstract way that people understand things they prefer not to examine, was almost certainly a crime. His phone buzzed. A text from his roommate, Dustin. "You coming back tonight? Rent's due Friday?" Leo turned the phone face down on the passenger seat. He thought about his mother in the dialysis chair, the way her skin had started to yellow, the way she smiled at him when he visited and pretended everything was fine. She had given him her car when he left for college, pressing the keys into his hand with a fierceness that surprised him. "You're going to need this more than I do," she had said. You're going to need to be able to leave when you need to leave. He had not understood what she meant at the time. He was beginning to understand now. He was still sitting there, constructing his final rationalization, when the door to room 14 opened and a man stepped out. He was short and barrel-chested, with the compressed energy of a spring under tension. His face had the kind of weathered opacity that comes from years of careful blankness. The face of a man who had learned early that expressions were liabilities. He walked to Leo's window without looking around, without hesitation, as though he had done this 1,000 times. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask Leo's name. He simply handed him a key attached to a plastic tag with a number on it. He handed him a phone, a cheap burner still in its packaging. He handed him an envelope thick enough to change the shape of his future. The van is in space. 47. White Ford Transit. The destination address is programmed into the phone. You do not stop unless you need gas. You do not speed. You do not attract attention. You arrive in 52 hours. The rest of the money will be waiting. He paused, and something in his eyes shifted. Something that might have been warning or might have been pity. Leo would think about that look later, replaying it endlessly, trying to decode what the man had known and whether he had been trying, in his own limited way, to offer mercy. There is one rule. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. You do not open the back. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think you hear, this is not negotiable. Leo wanted to ask questions. What was in the back? Why it mattered? What would happen if he broke the rule? But the man's face made it clear that questions were not part of this transaction. There was a script, and Leo's role in it did not include improvisation. Then the man turned and walked back into the motel room and closed the door. And Leo sat there with $12,000 in his lap and a key that felt like a signed confession. No matter what you hear. He should have understood then. He should have driven away, left the key on the pavement, found some other way to solve his problems. But desperation has its own logic, its own gravity, and Leo was already falling. He got out of the car and walked toward Space 47, where a white van sat waiting in the darkness like a held breath. He had no way of knowing that in 42 hours he would be dead. He had no way of knowing that the thing in the back of the van was not a victim. It was a trap, and he was walking into it with his eyes wide open and his hand on the key. The van was exactly where the man had said it would be. White, windowless in the cargo section, unremarkable in every way. The kind of vehicle that disappeared into traffic. The witnesses forgot the moment it passed that existed in the blind spot of human attention. Leo walked around it once, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, noting the Arizona plates, the dealer sticker from a lot in Tucson, the thin layer of dust that suggested it had been sitting here for days. The back doors had been fitted with a heavy padlock, the hasp welded directly to the metal. No handles on the inside, he noted. No way to open it from within. He stood there for a long moment, staring at those doors. The padlock was substantial, a hardened steel shackle that would require bolt cutters to defeat. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that whatever was inside stayed inside. Leo pressed his ear to the metal. Silence. Not even the hum of a refrigeration unit or the whir of a ventilation fan. Just dead. Insulated quiet. He told himself this was a good sign. Drugs didn't make noise. Documents didn't make noise. Whatever was in there, it was probably exactly what he wanted it to be. Something valuable, something illegal, something that was none of his business. He climbed into the driver's seat and sat for a moment, letting his hands rest on the wheel. The interior smelled new, that chemical plastic scent of fresh upholstery. The gas tank was full. The phone, when he powered it on, showed a single destination, an address in the industrial corridor east of Baltimore, arrival time calculated to the minute. The route was strange. Leo studied it for several minutes, trying to understand the logic. It avoided major highways where possible, favoring smaller state roads that wound through empty country. It added hours to the trip that a more direct path would have saved. It was, he realized slowly, a route designed to minimize the chances of being stopped, questioned, remembered. Leo pulled out of the parking lot at 12:23 a.m. and merged onto the interstate heading east. The envelope sat on the passenger seat beside him, and he did not touch it again. He drove through the empty desert with both hands on the wheel, the radio silent, watching the broken white lines vanish beneath the hood in an endless rhythm. For the first 6 hours, the back of the van was silent. Leo allowed himself to relax incrementally, muscle by muscle. The sun rose over New Mexico, painting the desert in shades of orange and pink, and for a little while he was just a young man driving east, watching the landscape scroll past, thinking about nothing in particular. He stopped for gas outside Albuquerque, using the cash from the envelope, keeping his face turned from the security cameras in the way he had seen people do in movies. The attendant was a woman in her 60s with a face like crumpled paper, and eyes that had seen too much to be curious about anything. She took his money without comment and went back to her crossword puzzle. Leo stood by the pump and looked at the van. In the harsh morning light, it looked ordinary, innocent even. Just a vehicle, just a job, just a means to an end. He did not look at the back. He did not think about what might be inside. He got back in and drove. And then, somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, the thumping began. We have already spoken of the thumping. We have already described the way Leo's hands went white on the steering wheel, the way his foot wavered between brake and accelerator, the way he chose. And it was a choice, the first of several that would lead him to his death, to keep driving. What we have not described is what happened next. The thumping stopped as the sun reached its zenith, the van rolling through the flat brown emptiness of the Texas Panhandle. Leo had turned on the radio by then, found a country station, playing songs about trucks and heartbreak, and cranked it loud enough to rattle the speakers. The music was a wall, a barrier between himself and whatever was happening behind him. As long as he couldn't hear it, he didn't have to think about it. He stopped for gas again in Amarillo, his hands trembling as he worked the pump. The station was a bright island of fluorescence in the gathering dusk, other travelers moving through the aisles like ghosts, and Leo stood beside the van and listened. Nothing. Perhaps whoever was back there had exhausted themselves. Perhaps they had given up. Perhaps, and this was the thought Leo clung to with pathetic desperation, perhaps the thumping had been something else entirely. A loose panel, a shifting load. The van settling on its suspension. He was filling a plastic bag with junk food from the gas station. Chips, candy bars, energy drinks, the sustenance of people trying not to think, when the screaming started. It came through the walls of the gas station, through the glass doors, through the country music playing on the overhead speakers. A sound so raw and desperate that it stopped Leo in his tracks, a bag of corn chips in one hand and his change in the other. The woman behind the counter looked up. An old man by the coffee machine turned his head. A mother with 2 children in tow ushered them quickly toward the door, her face pale. Everyone heard it. Everyone looked toward the parking lot, toward the white van sitting under the sodium lights, and Leo felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Do something, he told himself. Say something. Tell them you don't know what's in there. Tell them you're just the driver. Tell them. The screaming stopped. The woman behind the counter was staring at him now, her eyes narrowed with something that wasn't quite suspicion, not yet, but was moving in that direction. The old man by the coffee machine had his phone in his hand. Leo walked to the counter. He paid for his junk food. He smiled at the woman. A terrible smile, he knew, the smile of a man whose face had forgotten how to work. And he said, "My dog, rescue greyhound, hates being left in the car." The woman's face relaxed. The old man put his phone away. The mother with the children was already gone, her crisis averted, her curiosity satisfied by someone else's explanation. "You should get that dog some training," the woman said. "It sounded like someone was killing it." Leo nodded. He thanked her. He walked back to the van on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and he climbed into the driver's seat, and he pulled out of the parking lot without looking back. He did not stop again for 7 hours. The silence stretched across the Texas border and into Oklahoma, through the night and into the gray hours of early morning. Leo drove without stopping, without eating, without allowing himself to think about what had happened at the gas station. The radio played on, a blur of country songs and late-night talk shows and static between stations, and the white lines kept disappearing beneath the hood in their endless rhythm. Somewhere in Missouri, in the dead hours before dawn, he pulled into a rest stop and parked in the farthest corner of the lot, where the sodium lights didn't reach and the shadows pooled like standing water. He sat there for a long time, his hands still on the wheel, staring at nothing. Then he began to cry. Great heaving sobs that shook his whole body, that left him gasping for air, that felt like something breaking inside him that would never be fixed. He cried for the person in the back of the van, whoever they were, whatever they had done to end up there. He cried for himself, for the person he had wanted to be and the person he had become. He cried for his mother, who had sacrificed everything to give him a chance, and who would never know how completely he had failed her. When he was finished, he wiped his face with his sleeve and looked at himself in the rearview mirror. The face that looked back was someone he didn't recognize. Hollow eyes, gray skin, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. The face of a man who had crossed the line and couldn't find his way back. He thought about driving to the nearest police station and turning himself in. He thought about opening the back of the van and facing whatever was inside. He thought about calling his mother, hearing her voice one more time, telling her he was sorry. Instead, he started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. The sun was rising over Illinois, painting the sky in shades of red and orange, when the voice spoke for the first time. "I know you can hear me." The words were muffled but distinct, filtering through the wall that separated the cab from the cargo area. A man's voice, hoarse and tired but calm, so calm that it made the screaming from the night before seem like it had come from someone else entirely. Leo's hands jerked on the wheel. The van swerved, then steadied. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "I know you're not one of them. The way you drive. Too careful, too nervous. You're not a professional. You're someone they hired. Someone who doesn't know what he's carrying." Leo reached for the radio, turned it up. A classic rock station, Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven. The irony was not lost on him. The voice continued, cutting through the music as if it weren't there. "My name is Garrett Holloway. I'm a federal agent. I've been working undercover for the past 18 months, infiltrating the Vega cartel in Sonora. 3 weeks ago, my cover was blown. They've been holding me ever since, moving me from place to place, keeping me alive for reasons I don't entirely understand." Leo turned the radio up louder. The speakers distorted, crackling with static. "They're taking me somewhere to be killed. I don't know where exactly, but I know what's waiting for me when we get there. A shallow grave in the desert, or a barrel of acid, or a chainsaw." The cartels are creative when it comes to sending messages. The voice paused. When it spoke again, it was softer and more intimate, as if the speaker had moved closer to the wall. I have a wife. Her name is Natalie. We met in college at a party I didn't want to go to. She was wearing a yellow dress, and she laughed at a joke I made, a stupid joke that wasn't even funny, and I knew right then that I was going to marry her. Leo's jaw clenched. He stared at the road ahead, at the white lines disappearing beneath the hood, and tried not to listen. We have a daughter, Chloe. She's 7 years old. She has her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and she wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up. Last month, she asked me to teach her how to ride a bike. I told her I would when I got home from this trip. The voice cracked just slightly, and Leo felt something crack inside himself as well. I'm not going to get home, am I? Unless you help me. Unless you stop this van and open that door and give me a chance to see my daughter again. Leo pulled off at the next exit, a rest stop with a single sodium light flickering above a shuttered vending machine. He sat there in the darkness with the engine running, his hands shaking on the wheel, while the voice continued its quiet pleading. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is some kind of trick. You're thinking I'm a criminal, a drug dealer, someone who deserves whatever's coming to him. But I'm not. I'm a federal agent, and I have a wife who's been calling my phone for 3 weeks without an answer. And I have a daughter who's been asking her mother when Daddy's coming home. Leo pressed his palms against his eyes until colors bloomed in the darkness. He thought about the man in the motel parking lot, the way he had said the rule, the deliberate weight he had placed on it. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think you hear. Check your phone. The burner they gave you. Look at the destination. Tell me I'm lying. Leo did not want to look. He looked anyway. The address was an industrial building in a district of Baltimore he had never heard of, but whose name carried its own grim poetry. Sparrow's Point. He searched for it on his personal phone, the one he had been told not to bring, but had brought anyway, hidden in the bottom of his bag. The search results painted a picture. Abandoned warehouses, derelict factories, a place where things went to disappear. They're going to kill me when we get there. The voice was quieter now, resigned. They're going to kill me and dump my body, and no one will ever know what happened to me. My wife will spend the rest of her life wondering. My daughter will grow up without a father, and you'll have to live with knowing you could have stopped it. Leo sat in the rest stop parking lot for 47 minutes, watching the bugs orbit the broken light, listening to a man describe his own death. He made his decision somewhere on Interstate 70, between exits with names he would never remember. The mathematics of it had shifted. The equation rebalanced by the weight of a voice in the darkness. $12,000 against a man's life. His mother's medical bills against a 7-year-old girl named Chloe who wanted to be a veterinarian. His degree, his future, his carefully constructed escape from poverty against the slow dissolution of whatever remained of his soul. Leo had always believed in the way that young people believe such things, that he would know what to do when the moment came. His high school counselor, Mrs. Okafor, had believed that about him. She had stayed late 3 nights a week to help him with his college applications. She had written him a recommendation letter that made him cry when he read it. Leo has a moral compass that points true north, she had written. He is, in the truest sense of the word, a good person. Now the needle spun wildly, finding no fixed point. Leo pulled into an empty parking lot behind a closed trucking company and killed the engine. The silence was immense. He could hear his own breathing, his own heartbeat, and beneath them both the quiet rustle of movement from the back of the van. He got out and walked to the rear doors with the padlock key in his hand. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and diesel fuel. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded, long and mournful. He stood there for a long moment, aware that he was about to cross a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The key felt impossibly heavy in his hand. On one side of this moment was the person he had been, flawed, desperate, but still capable of believing he was doing what he had to do. On the other side was whatever came next. He thought about his mother. He thought about Mrs. Okafor. He thought about the 7-year-old girl named Chloe who was waiting for her father to come home. Then he fitted the key to the lock and turned it. The doors swung open onto darkness. The interior of the cargo area had been modified. The walls lined with the soundproofing foam, the floor fitted with heavy-duty eye bolts. In the far corner, illuminated by the faint light from the parking lot's single lamp, a man lay on his side with his ankles chained and his wrists bound behind him. A strip of duct tape covered his mouth. He was older than Leo had expected, somewhere in his middle 40s, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, a nose that had been broken and reset slightly off-center, a jaw that jutted at an aggressive angle, cheekbones that seemed to belong to two different people. His eyes, when they found Leo's, were clear and sharp and utterly calm. That calmness should have been the first warning. A man who had been chained in the back of a van for days, a man who was being transported to his own execution, should not have eyes like that. Should not be able to look at his rescuer with the cool assessment of someone evaluating a tool. Leo did not notice. He was too busy being a hero. He climbed into the van, his hands shaking as he worked at the duct tape, peeling it carefully away from the man's face. The skin beneath was raw and irritated, marked by what looked like days of captivity. "Thank you." The man's voice was hoarse, stripped raw from screaming, from pleading, from hours of talking through the wall. "Thank you. I didn't think you would stop." Leo found a box cutter in the front of the van and used it to saw through the zip ties on the man's wrists. The chains on his ankles were secured with a combination lock. The man knew the code, he said. Had seen them input it when they first put him in. Leo watched his fingers work the dial, noted the efficiency of the movements, the way his hands did not tremble despite everything, and felt the first faint stirring of unease. But unease was not enough to stop him. Not now. Not when he had already come this far. The chains fell away. The man, Garrett, he had said his name was Garrett, stood slowly, unfolding joints that had been cramped for too long. He was taller than Leo had realized, broad-shouldered and solidly built despite his captivity. He moved with a careful, considered grace that suggested training of some kind. "We need to move." His voice was stronger now, taking on a tone of command that Leo found himself responding to automatically. "There's a police station in Cumberland, 30 minutes east. They'll have everything they need there. Access to federal databases, secure communications. Can you drive?" Leo nodded. He was operating on autopilot now, his conscious mind several steps behind his actions. He had freed a federal agent from a cartel execution. He had done the right thing. The story he would tell himself later was already forming, a narrative of moral courage that would help him sleep at night. They drove east through the darkness, the man called Garrett sitting in the passenger seat where the envelope of cash had been. He had taken it, tucked it into his waistband without comment, and Leo had not objected. It seemed unimportant now. The math had changed. Garrett talked as they drove about the Vega cartel, their operations in Sonora, the months he had spent building a cover identity. He talked about his wife, his daughter, the beach house in Delaware where he had proposed. His voice was warm and grateful and full of the kind of details that made a story feel true. "She made me pinky swear," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like affection. "Chloe, before I left. She made me pinky swear I'd come back. You know how kids are about pinky swears. Leo nodded, his throat tight. He thought about his own mother, waiting for him in Tempe, not knowing where he was or what he was doing. You saved my life, Garrett said. I want you to understand that. Whatever happens next, whatever questions they ask you, you're a hero. You did something most people wouldn't have the courage to do. Leo felt something ease in his chest that had been tight for 2 days. He had made the right choice. He had saved a man's life. Whatever came next, the questions, the investigation, the inevitable exposure of his own complicity. He had done something good. That would have to matter. The police station in Cumberland, Maryland was a low brick building set back from the main road, its windows dark except for the reception area. A few cruisers sat in the lot, their roof lights dormant. The building had the sleepy, underfunded look of small-town law enforcement everywhere. A place where the night shift meant one deputy and a pot of bad coffee, where the most exciting call was usually a domestic disturbance or a drunk driver. Pull around back. Garrett's voice had changed subtly. Harder now, more businesslike. Less grateful. Wait in the car. I'll go in, establish my credentials, get the ball rolling. They'll want to take a statement from you, but that can wait until I've made contact with my field office. Leo pulled into a space near the back entrance. The lot was empty except for a single cruiser, its windows dark. The building itself was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over places in the small hours of the morning. Garrett opened his door, paused, and turned back with something that might have been a smile. In the pale glow of the dome light, his features looked different somehow, sharper, more angular, as though the soft edges of the grateful victim were beginning to melt away. You did a good thing tonight. I want you to know that. Whatever happens next, you made the right choice. Then he was gone, walking toward the building with that same careful, considered grace. Leo watched him go, watched him pull open the door and disappear inside, and sat back in his seat with a sigh that felt like release. It was over. The nightmare was over. He had done something terrible, and then he had done something good, and maybe the two would balance out in whatever cosmic ledger kept track of such things. Leo was reaching for the radio when his eyes found the bulletin board. It stood beside the building's entrance, a glass-fronted case illuminated by an interior light. Most of it was taken up with community notices, blood drives, safety tips, warnings about phone scams. But the bottom row held something else, a series of photographs printed on white paper, arranged under a header that read, "Wanted by the FBI." Leo's gaze moved across them without much interest. Grainy mugshots of men with forgettable faces. A woman with dead eyes and a scar on her chin. And then, third from the left, the photograph that made his heart stop beating. The man in the picture had close-cropped gray hair, a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, clear, sharp eyes that stared out of the photograph with an expression of amused contempt. Leo was out of the van before he knew he was moving, crossing the distance to the bulletin board in a kind of fugue state, his vision tunneling down to that single image. The text beneath it swam into focus, word by terrible word. Gillette, Dean Henry. Wanted for serial murder, 14 counts, kidnapping, torture, interstate transportation for illegal activity. Known aliases: Garrett Holloway, David Marchetti, Raymond Cole. Considered extremely dangerous, do not approach. Below the formal text, in smaller print, was a summary of his crimes. Leo read it in fragments, his mind rejecting each piece as it tried to fit them together. 14 documented victims over 11 years. All men, all held for extended periods before death. Bodies found in remote locations, arranged in poses that defied easy interpretation. Details the Bureau declined to release. The FBI profile described him as highly intelligent, patient, and possessing an exceptional ability to manipulate others. Subjects report feeling an immediate sense of trust, the summary read. Subject displays superficial charm and a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. He selects victims who are isolated, vulnerable, or whose disappearance will not be immediately noticed. Leo thought about the voice through the wall, the wife, the daughter, the beach house in Delaware, the pinky swear. Every detail calibrated, every word chosen to produce a specific response. He had been played like an instrument by a virtuoso. And at the bottom, a recent addition, handwritten on a sticky note affixed to the glass. Subject reportedly captured by Vega cartel operatives in Sonora, Mexico, March 2024. Believed executed. Status unconfirmed. Leo turned slowly, very slowly, and looked at the police station's back door. It was still closed. He could walk inside right now and find an officer, explain everything. He could... The door opened, and Dean Gillette stepped through it. He moved differently now. The grateful victim was gone, that carefully constructed performance, shed like a snake shedding skin. In its place was something else, something that walked with the unhurried confidence of a creature at the top of its food chain. His hands hung loose at his sides, and in the dim light, Leo could see dark stains on his fingers, on his shirt cuffs, stains that had not been there before. The night deputy. There had been a night deputy inside. Gillette saw Leo standing at the bulletin board and smiled. It was not a human smile. It was the expression a cat makes when it sees a mouse that has nowhere left to run. He did not hurry. He walked across the parking lot in a straight line, his eyes never leaving Leo's face. And Leo understood with a clarity that bordered on revelation that he was going to die tonight. That he had been going to die from the moment he opened that envelope in the motel parking lot. From the moment he had turned the key in the padlock. From the moment he was born. There is a mechanism in the human brain that activates in moments of extreme terror. A kind of shutting down, a circuit breaker tripping to prevent overload. Leo felt it engaged now, his fear reaching a crescendo, and then flattening into something like acceptance. His body grew very still. His breathing slowed. The world acquired a hyper-real clarity, every detail rendered in perfect focus. The cracks in the asphalt, the rust spots on the sodium lamp's housing, the small smile playing at the corners of Dean Gillette's mouth. You read it. His voice was different, too, softer, almost intimate. The hoarseness was gone, and Leo realized with a chill that the hoarseness had been part of the performance, another carefully calibrated detail. That's disappointing. I was hoping we'd have more time to get to know each other. Leo could not speak. His throat had closed around whatever words he might have formed. The cartel took me in March. Gillette spoke casually, as though discussing the weather. They lost someone I'd grown fond of, the daughter of one of their bosses. She was special. They didn't appreciate the attention I showed her. He took another step forward. Leo stepped back involuntarily, his shoulders pressing against the glass of the bulletin board. They were going to execute me, make an example. Instead, they hired someone to transport me, someone who didn't know what he was carrying, who would be untraceable, someone disposable. Another step. Leo could smell him now, a faint odor of copper and sweat, and something else beneath it, something chemical and wrong, like formaldehyde cut with something sweeter. But you opened the door. His voice dropped to something almost like tenderness. You listened to my story and you believed it, because you wanted to believe it. Because the alternative was too ugly to contemplate. And that's what I love about people like you, Leo. Your capacity for self-deception is practically infinite. He was close enough to touch now, close enough that Leo could see the fine capillaries in his eyes, the slight asymmetry of his features. the way his pupils had dilated in a way that suggested pleasure. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. The next few hours are going to be very difficult for you. But if you cooperate, if you're very, very good, I might make it quick. That's more than I usually offer. His hand came up, and Leo saw something in it. A service pistol, matte black, held with the casual ease of long familiarity. The night deputy's weapon. The night deputy, who would never go home to his family, who would be found in the morning by whoever came to relieve him. Now let's take a drive. I know a place where no one will disturb us. Leo's keys were still in his pocket. The van was 30 feet away. The police station door was 20. He could run, he could scream, he could fight. He did none of these things. He stood there frozen as Dean Gillette took his arm with almost paternal gentleness and guided him toward the van. The gun pressed into the small of his back, a cold circle of certainty, and Leo's legs carried him forward without his permission. His body had already surrendered. His mind was simply catching up. He was aware of being placed in the passenger seat. He was aware of the engine starting, of the van moving, of the police station growing smaller in the rearview mirror. He did not look back to see if anyone came out. He knew no one would. The last thing he saw clearly was Dean Gillette's profile against the passing. I'm patient. I can wait. Eventually, someone opens the door. He smiled again, that same empty, terrible smile. Someone always opens the door. The van turned onto a dark road, its headlights cutting a narrow path through the forest. Behind them, the lights of Cumberland faded and disappeared. Ahead there was only darkness and the soft sound of humming, something classical, something with strings, and the heavy silence of a predator alone with his prey. Leo Padilla was never seen again. 3 weeks later, a hiker in the Alleghenies found something arranged on a flat rock overlooking the valley. The positioning was deliberate, almost artistic, a composition that suggested meaning without revealing it, like a sentence in a language the viewer could almost but not quite understand. The local sheriff's department had never seen anything like it. Neither had the FBI team that arrived 48 hours later, though their records contained photographs that suggested someone had. The lead investigator, a woman named Prescott, who had studied Gillette's case for 7 years, stood at the edge of the crime scene and felt something she had not felt in a long time: fear. Not the professional concern of a detective confronting violence, but something older, something that lived in the brainstem and whispered of predators in the dark. The scene before her was a message written in a language she understood all too well. "I'm back," it said. "I never left." In Baltimore, at the industrial address programmed into a burner phone that was never recovered, representatives of the Vega cartel waited in vain for a delivery that would never arrive. They made inquiries. They traced the route. They found the parking lot in Illinois, the rest stops, the gas stations, all the places where a young man with desperate eyes had stopped and bought junk food and tried not to think about what he was carrying. What they did not find was the van. What they did not find was their prisoner. What they understood with the sick certainty of people who had made a catastrophic miscalculation was that Dean Gillette was free again. In Tempe, Arizona, a woman named Maria Padilla filed a missing persons report for her son. She told the detective that Leo had been under a lot of stress lately, that he'd been worried about money, that he had promised to call her when he got back from a trip he had been vague about. She showed them a photograph of him at his high school graduation, smiling in his cap and gown, his whole future ahead of him. The detective took notes and made sympathetic noises and filed the report with all the others. College students went missing sometimes. They dropped out, ran away, started new lives. Most of them turned up eventually. Leo Padilla did not turn up. The bulletin board outside the Cumberland Police Department was updated the following month. The sticky note with its hopeful, unconfirmed status was removed. In its place, someone had typed a single word in red ink and affixed it to the glass with clear tape. Active. 6 months later, on a road very much like the one Leo Padilla had driven, a white van rolled through the darkness. Its cargo area had been refitted, the chains oiled, the soundproofing replaced. In the passenger seat, there was an envelope thick with cash, and a burner phone showing a destination in another city, and a key that would open doors that should remain forever closed. The driver was young, maybe 22, with the unmistakable look of someone who had run out of options and was trying very hard not to think about what that meant. His name was different from Leo's, but his story was the same. Student loans he couldn't pay, a sick mother, a future that had narrowed to a single point of desperate light. His hands were steady on the wheel. His radio played something soft and forgettable. He had been driving for 6 hours, and the back of the van had been silent the whole time. Then, somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, just as the sun crested the horizon, he heard a sound. A thumping at first. Rhythmic. Insistent. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Pause. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. He knew what that rhythm meant. Everyone knew what that rhythm meant. SOS. He thought about stopping. He thought about the key in his pocket, about the doors that were only 30 feet behind him, about the person who might be trapped back there, might be scared, might be innocent. He thought about the money and his debts, and all the stories he could tell himself about what he was really carrying. The thumping continued, then stopped, then started again, and then muffled but distinct, filtering through the soundproof wall. A voice. "Please, help me?" The driver turned up the radio. He pressed the accelerator. The van sped up, carrying its cargo east, toward a destination he did not want to think about, toward a future he could not see. "I know you can hear me." The voice was calm, reasonable, desperate. Everything a victim's voice should be. "My name is Garrett Holloway. I'm a federal agent." The driver did not stop. He had heard the stories. Everyone in his world had heard the stories about what happened to people who asked too many questions, who opened doors they were told to keep closed. He was smarter than that. He was more careful. He would make the delivery. He would collect his money. He would go home and pay his debts and never think about this again. And somewhere in the darkness behind him, in a space fitted with chains and soundproofing, something listened to the radio playing through the wall. Something smiled at the sound of the engine accelerating, at the feel of the van moving faster down the highway. Something waited, patient, hungry, knowing that sooner or later the driver would stop. Sooner or later, the voice would find the right words, the right story, the right combination of details that would unlock the door. It might take hours, it might take days. But eventually, someone always opens the door.